There is a submarine sitting on dry land in northern Germany. It has been there for decades. It does not move. It does not dive. The sea that once surrounded it is roughly a kilometer away, and the only waves that reach it now are the ones you can hear on a quiet day if the wind is coming from the right direction. Children walk through it on school trips. Old men stand at its hatch and go very still. It is called U-995, and it is the last of its kind anywhere on Earth. Every other submarine of its type, and there were nearly 700 of them built, is gone, sunk in combat, scuttled by their own crews, cut apart for scrap metal in the years after the war ended, dissolved back into the industrial economy that made them, leaving almost nothing behind. The ocean floor of the North Atlantic holds the remains of hundreds of them, pressed into the cold dark at depths no light reaches, carrying the bones of the men who never came home. And yet this one survived. This particular boat, laid down in a Hamburg shipyard during the second year of the most destructive war in human history, commissioned into a fleet already beginning to bleed, sent out across some of the most violent and unforgiving water on the planet. This one came through. That alone would be worth examining. But U-995 carries something more than its own survival. It carries the whole weight of what the German submarine campaign was, what it cost, what it destroyed, what it failed to achieve, and what it meant to the tens of thousands of young men who climbed down into boats like it and pushed out beneath the surface of the sea, most of them never to return. More than 30,000 German submariners died in the Second World War. That figure deserves a moment. More than 30,000. The U-boat arm had one of the highest casualty rates of any military branch on any side in any theater of that war. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in operational U-boats, nearly 3/4 were killed. The boats that did not come back silently. They went down fighting, or they went down ambushed, or they went down so fast that no one inside them had time to understand what was happening. They sank in the North Atlantic. They sank in the Arctic. They sank in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, off the coast of West Africa, in the English Channel. They sank in waters their crews had never seen before and would not see again. And Allied sailors died too. Merchant sailors, convoy escort crews, men on both sides of the longest continuous naval campaign in that war. A campaign that began on the 3rd of September, 1939, the very first day Britain and Germany were at war, and did not end until Germany surrendered in the spring of 1945. Nearly 6 years. Nearly 6 years of submarine warfare stretching across millions of square kilometers of open ocean, hidden, relentless, largely invisible to the people living on land who were fighting and dying in other ways, in other places. This documentary is about one boat, but one boat, if you look at it carefully enough, contains everything. It contains the engineering ambition of a navy that was forbidden to build submarines and built them anyway. It contains the industrial capacity of a nation that could produce steel and machinery and trained crew at a rate that stunned the world, even as that nation was committing crimes that still cannot be fully reckoned with. It contains the tactical ingenuity of officers and men who developed entirely new ways of killing at sea, and who then watched those methods become obsolete under the pressure of an Allied technological and industrial response they had no answer for. It contains the lived experience, the smell, the cold, the fear, the dark humor, the extraordinary intimacy of 50 men crammed into a pressure hull not much longer than 2 double-decker buses placed end to end, of a kind of warfare that most of us will never come close to understanding. And it contains the long silence of the decades after, the questions that come when a war ends and a nation has to look at what it did and decide what to remember and how to remember it, and what to do with the physical objects that survive. What do you do with a submarine? What do you do with something that was both a weapon of a criminal regime and a workplace where ordinary young men lived and suffered, and in overwhelming numbers died? How do you put a museum plaque on something like that and call it history? U-995 has been sitting with those questions for a long time. It has no answers. It is a steel hull, but the fact that it exists, that it was not scuttled, not scrapped, not lost, means the questions at least have somewhere to stand. We are going to start at the beginning, not with U-995 itself, but with the world that made it possible, the humiliation of Versailles, the secret programs hidden inside foreign shell companies, the engineers who kept submarine knowledge alive across the lean years between the wars, because they believed, or were told to believe, that it would be needed again. We are going to follow the Type VIIC design from the drawing board, through the shipyard floor, and into the water. We are going to follow U-995 through her construction, her training, her operational patrols in some of the worst sea conditions on Earth. We are going to go below the surface with her crew, not just in a tactical sense, but in a human one. We are going to look at what those men ate, how they slept, what they were afraid of, what kept them going, what broke them. We are going to examine the technology race that raged around them. Radar, code breaking, new weapons on both sides. A race U-995 and her sister ships were ultimately losing, though the men inside did not always know it. We are going to trace the slow collapse of the campaign they were part of, and follow this one boat through to the moment the war ended, and she did not go to the bottom with the others. And then we are going to stand with her on the shore at Le Bouvre, where she has been for longer now than the war itself lasted, and think about what it means that she is still here. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. If you have been with this channel before, you know what kind of history we make here. Careful, detailed, built for long evenings, and the kind of attention that deserves something worth attending to. This is a story that has never quite been told this way, and we are going to take our time with it. Get comfortable, settle in. If this is the kind of history that keeps you up when you should be sleeping, or, just as likely, the kind that finally lets you rest, then this is exactly the right place to be. The story of U-995 begins not in Hamburg and not in the sea. It begins in a defeated country, in the ruins of one war, in the first quiet preparations for another. It begins with a navy that was told it would never have submarines again and decided not to believe it. There is a boat sitting on dry land in northern Germany, resting on concrete cradles, a short walk from the shore of the Baltic Sea. She has not moved under her own power in more than half a century. Her hull is painted the same grey it wore in wartime, and the salt air of Kiel Bay works at her steel the way it always has, patiently, without mercy. Visitors walk through her hatches and crouch through her watertight doors and emerge blinking into the daylight with the same expression, a kind of stunned compression, a physical understanding of what it meant to live inside something so small for so long. She is designated U-995, and she is the last of her kind anywhere on Earth. To understand what she is and what she carries, you have to go back much further than the slipway where she was built, back to a moment of national humiliation that made her existence both forbidden and, in the minds of the men who would one day build her, absolutely inevitable. The 11th of November, 1918, the guns fell silent across the Western Front after more than 4 years of industrial slaughter. Germany did not surrender on the battlefield in any conventional sense. Her armies were still standing on foreign soil, but the political collapse at home had already made continued fighting impossible. When the armistice came, and then the treaty negotiations that followed it at Versailles, the victorious Allied powers sat down to write the terms by which Germany would be permanently diminished as a military force. They had fought a war they never wanted to fight again. They intended to make certain that Germany could not force them into one. What emerged from those negotiations, signed in the Hall of Mirrors in June of 1919, was a document that the German officer class would spend the next 2 decades treating as an existential wound rather than a legal settlement. The Treaty of Versailles did not merely limit the German Navy. It effectively abolished it as a fighting force capable of projecting power. The German surface fleet, already scuttled in a final act of defiance by its own crews at Scapa Flow in June of 1919, was to be replaced by a rump organization, permitted a handful of obsolete battleships, a small number of light cruisers, and torpedo boats below a fixed displacement limit. The officer corps was capped, the enlisted strength was capped, and submarines, the weapon that had very nearly strangled Britain's Atlantic supply lines and brought the war to an entirely different conclusion, were banned outright. Not restricted, not limited in number, banned. No German naval vessel might carry torpedoes capable of being fired underwater. The U-boat, in the eyes of the treaty's framers, was simply to cease to exist. What the treaty's framers could not so easily abolish was knowledge. The German Imperial Navy had ended the war with the most sophisticated submarine doctrine, the most experienced torpedo crews, and some of the most advanced underwater engineering in the world. The men who had built those boats and sailed them and learned, at terrible cost, what worked and what did not, were still alive. They still remembered. And within a naval establishment that had been humiliated but not disbanded, there were officers who regarded the Versailles restrictions not as permanent law, but as a temporary obstacle to be circumnavigated with patience and ingenuity. The institutional memory of the submarine service did not die in 1918. It went underground, in both a literal and a professional sense, and it waited. The mechanism by which that knowledge was preserved was, in retrospect, audacious in its transparency. Beginning in the mid-1920s, German naval authorities quietly established or supported a series of commercial enterprises operating outside Germany's borders, each nominally independent, each entirely deniable, and each devoted to keeping submarine engineering alive as a practical discipline. The most significant of these was a design office established in the Netherlands, operating under a Dutch corporate identity that would eventually be known by its informal designation as the Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw, the engineering office for shipbuilding. It employed German naval architects. It worked on submarine designs, and it did so in plain sight of anyone paying attention, which, for years, very few people in the Allied monitoring apparatus were. Through this Dutch office, and through parallel arrangements in Spain and Finland, German engineers did not merely sketch theoretical designs and file them in drawers. They built boats. In Finland, a coastal submarine was designed and constructed that served as a working laboratory for hull forms, diving systems, and propulsion arrangements. In Spain, similar contracts produced vessels that allowed German naval architects to test ideas under operational conditions, to observe failures, to refine solutions. The men involved were not rogue actors or freelancers. They maintained contact with the German naval command structure, and the knowledge they gathered was systematically fed back into a body of technical understanding that Germany's official navy could claim, with some plausibility, to know nothing about. The pretense was thin, but pretense was, for the moment, sufficient. What these engineers were refining during these years was not simply a technical package, but a design philosophy, a particular answer to the question of what a submarine should fundamentally be. The naval arms races of the early 20th century had produced boats of considerable size and range, vessels intended for long-range oceanic warfare or fleet support roles. Some German thinkers favored continuing in that direction. Others argued for something different: a medium-sized, highly maneuverable, mass-producible attack boat, optimized for the North Atlantic approaches to Britain, shallow enough in draft to work the coastal zones, deep diving enough to survive punishment, simple enough in construction to be built in quantity. This second school of thought would eventually win the argument. Its product would be the Type VII. The Type VII's conceptual lineage traces directly back through the Finnish and Dutch design work of the 1920s, and beyond that, to the most successful German submarine types of the First World War. It was not a revolutionary design. It was a deeply considered evolutionary one, refined across more than a decade of theoretical work and practical experiment, shaped by men who had spent years studying both what had worked and what had killed their colleagues. By the early 1930s, as the political situation in Germany shifted, with accelerating violence toward the National Socialist government that would take power in January of 1933, the design existed in a form sophisticated enough to move toward production. All that remained was for the official prohibition to be set aside, and a regime had now arrived in Berlin that had no interest whatsoever in honoring the constraints of Versailles. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 was, in retrospect, one of the more extraordinary diplomatic documents of the interwar period, concluded bilaterally between Britain and Germany, and to the considerable irritation of France, which had not been consulted. It permitted Germany to rebuild a surface fleet up to 35% of British naval tonnage, and explicitly allowed Germany to construct a submarine fleet up to 45% of Britain's submarine strength, with provision to reach full parity in certain circumstances. Britain had, in effect, unilaterally torn up the naval clauses of Versailles and handed Germany permission to rearm underwater. The reasons were complex: a mixture of appeasement ideology, a belief that controlled German rearmament was preferable to uncontrolled German rearmament, and a profound British establishment desire to avoid another war at almost any cost. Whatever the reasoning, the practical consequence was immediate. The Kriegsmarine, the new German Navy, could now build submarines openly, and it intended to do exactly that. The first boats laid down under the new program were small coastal types, useful for Baltic training, but limited in ocean range. The Type VIIC followed, and then the Type VIIB, each iteration refining the basic hull form, improving range and diving characteristics, incorporating lessons from the secret years of development. The pace of construction was deliberately measured at first. The industrial base needed to be expanded, the training pipeline needed to be established, the tactical doctrine needed to be formalized and tested. But the direction was never in doubt. Germany was building a submarine fleet designed for one primary strategic mission: the interdiction of the Atlantic trade routes that kept Britain alive. The men who designed it understood what that meant. Many of them had tried to accomplish exactly that mission once before, and had come within reach of success before being stopped. They did not intend to make the same mistakes twice. By the time the Second Great European War began, in September of 1939, the Kriegsmarine had on hand a submarine force that was smaller than its most ambitious advocates had hoped for, but more capable, boat for boat, than almost anything it would face. The Type VIIC, the definitive version of the design that had been gestating since the 1920s, would begin entering service in 1940 and would eventually be produced in numbers that dwarfed any other submarine class in history. Hundreds of boats, thousands of men, a campaign of underwater warfare conducted across millions of square miles of ocean that would consume both sides for the better part of 6 years. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, laid down in Hamburg, built by workers who were themselves living inside a war, commissioned into a service whose losses were already becoming devastating, a single hull was taking shape. Her builders gave her a number. They gave her steel. The sea would give her everything else. When German naval engineers sat down to design what would become the backbone of the Kriegsmarine's underwater fleet, they faced a problem that had no clean solution. A submarine is, by its nature, a machine built from contradictions. It must be large enough to carry fuel, weapons, and men across thousands of miles of open ocean, yet small enough to dive quickly, maneuver precisely, and hide in the depth of the sea. It must be mechanically complex enough to perform a dozen simultaneous functions: propulsion, life support, fire control, navigation, yet simple enough that a crew of exhausted, salt-crusted men can maintain it in the dark while someone above them is trying to kill them. Every design choice is a compromise. Every dimension gained in one direction costs something in another. The engineers who produced the Type VIIC knew this, accepted it, and pressed forward anyway. What they produced was not a perfect weapon. It was something more interesting than that, a deliberately balanced one. The Type VIIC grew from a lineage that stretched back through the Type VIII and Type VIIB, each iteration refining the formula its predecessors had established. The class settled on a length of roughly 67 meters from bow to stern, not a large vessel by the standards of surface warships, but substantial when you understand that almost every centimeter of that length was occupied by machinery, stores, weapons, or men. The pressure hull, the inner steel tube that actually held back the ocean, was considerably narrower than the outer casing gave the impression of, and it was within that inner cylinder that the crew of around 50 men lived, worked, and attempted to sleep. The outer hull gave the boat its hydrodynamic shape above the waterline. Below the surface, only the pressure hull mattered, and it compressed every human function: eating, sleeping, navigation, engineering, command, into a space that a modest apartment dweller might find uncomfortably familiar. The displacement ran to roughly 760 tons when surfaced, rising to 865 tons when submerged, as ballast tanks flooded and the boat took on the weight of the water it displaced. These numbers made the Type VIIC a medium submarine, neither the smallest coastal boat nor the largest ocean-going type, which was, in fact, precisely the point. The choice of medium size was not an accident or a resource compromise. It was a deliberate strategic calculation rooted in German naval doctrine and in the hard lessons of the First World War's submarine campaigns. A medium boat could be produced quickly, in large numbers, and at a fraction of the cost and labor required by the larger ocean-going types. It could operate across the full breadth of the North Atlantic, while still being nimble enough to evade and dive. The Kriegsmarine and its leadership understood, at least in theory, and at least early in the war, that the decisive factor in a submarine campaign against British supply lines would be mass, not individual capability. One extraordinarily capable submarine sinking 3 ships was less strategically valuable than 10 adequate submarines each sinking 1. The Type VIIC was engineered to be producible. The Blohm und Voss yard in Hamburg alone turned out boats at a pace that had no historical parallel in submarine construction, and across the network of German shipyards, the class would eventually number in the hundreds. That productive capacity was itself a form of strategic power. The propulsion system reflected the same dual-purpose logic that governed everything else about the boat. On the surface, 2-man diesel engines drove the Type VIII forward, at speeds approaching 17 knots under good conditions, fast enough to reposition, to chase a convoy's reported position, or to run from a pursuing escort on the surface in darkness. Below the surface, electric motors drawing from large banks of lead-acid batteries took over, and the picture changed entirely. Submerged speed dropped to roughly 7 or 8 knots at best, and that pace was unsustainable. Running at maximum underwater speed drained the battery banks in under an hour. Economical submerged cruising, at speeds more like 2 to 3 knots, could extend endurance underwater to perhaps 18 or 20 hours before the batteries needed recharging, and recharging meant surfacing, starting the diesels, and exposing the boat to every threat the surface world held. The fundamental tactical rhythm of a U-boat patrol was built around this constraint: surface at night, charge, move, hunt, dive by day, endure, wait. This rhythm worked when the Allies could not find a surfaced U-boat in darkness. It became lethal when they could. The weapons load was purpose-built for convoy warfare. The standard fit provided 14 torpedoes, 4 bow tubes, and 1 stern tube, each loaded, with additional reloads stored in racks beneath the floor gratings of the forward torpedo compartment. The crew who worked in that space, typically the more junior ratings, slept among the reload torpedoes when all bunks were occupied, which they usually were. A Type VIIC on full war load also carried a deck gun of 88mm, useful in the early war period for finishing off damaged merchant vessels without expending valuable torpedoes. Though as Allied air coverage extended across the Atlantic, surfacing to use deck artillery became progressively more dangerous until the practice was largely abandoned. Anti-aircraft armament evolved considerably as the war progressed, with additional guns fitted to the conning tower platform in an attempt to give the boats some deterrent against attacking aircraft. It was never enough. An aircraft diving from altitude with the element of surprise was something no modification to the conning tower could reliably counter. The operational ceiling for diving, the rated test depth, was specified at around 200 meters, though experienced commanders knew the structural reality was more nuanced than a single number implied. The pressure hull was engineered to significant safety margins above the rated figure, and boats under depth charge attack routinely dove deeper than official limits when the alternative was destruction. The creaking and groaning of steel under extreme pressure, the slight but terrifying flexion of hull fittings, the condensation that rained from every surface as the temperature differential between the cold, deep water and the warm interior air became overwhelming. All of this was part of the lived experience of a deep dive under attack. The boat could go deeper than the numbers suggested. How much deeper was something each crew discovered under the worst possible circumstances, usually only once. The torpedo fire control arrangements were sophisticated for the period, combining mechanical computing devices with navigational data to solve the geometry of an attacking approach, the target's course, speed, range, and angle on the bow, converted into a firing solution that accounted for the torpedo's running time and spread angle. In practice, this calculated precision existed in constant tension with the reality of attack conditions: poor visibility, moving targets, active escorts, and the psychological pressure of an approach that might at any moment become a fight for survival. Experienced commanders developed an intuitive sense for the calculation that supplemented and sometimes overrode the mechanical solution. The torpedo, once fired, ran its course alone. There was no correction, no guidance. You solved the problem in your mind, pressed the button, and waited. Fuel capacity gave the Type VIIC a range of around 8,000 nautical miles at economical surface cruising speed, enough to reach the waters west of Ireland and return without resupply. enough to push toward the mid-Atlantic gap, where Allied air coverage was initially absent. When forward bases in occupied France were available from 1940 onward, this range extended the effective operational area considerably, allowing boats to deploy from the Bay of Biscay and spend more of their fuel on the hunting grounds rather than the transit. The Norwegian bases that U-995 would later use changed the geometry again, redirecting fuel budgets northward toward the Arctic routes. The Type VIIC's range was one of its genuine strengths. It was a boat that could go where the war demanded, even if getting there and back consumed the largest portion of every patrol. What the specifications cannot convey, what no table of numbers ever captures, is the human cost embedded in every design decision. The 50-odd men who crewed a Type VIIC existed in a space so compressed that personal privacy was a concept without meaning. Two men often shared a single bunk in rotation, one sleeping while the other stood watch. The practice known, with the grim pragmatism of men who had accepted their situation, as the hot bunk. The air inside the boat on a long submerged run became thick with carbon dioxide, diesel exhaust residue, the smell of unwashed bodies, the penetrating odor of battery acid, and the accumulated condensation from every exhalation of every man aboard. Fresh food lasted perhaps 2 weeks before the boat existed entirely on tinned and preserved rations. Bread went moldy within days in the humidity. A shower was a concept belonging to the world above the sea. In this environment, across patrols that might run to 8 or 10 weeks, men maintained complex machinery, made life and death decisions, and somehow sustained the routine discipline that kept them alive. The Type VIIC's weaknesses were as structural as its strengths. The greatest of them was the same quality that made it producible: its size. The boat was not large enough to carry the air search radar and sophisticated electronic equipment that might have redressed the balance as Allied technology advanced. Modifications were grafted onto the hull at intervals, each one adding weight and complexity without fundamentally altering what the boat was. It remained a medium submarine designed for a specific tactical environment that the Allies systematically dismantled. The schnorkel breathing mast, which would eventually allow the diesel engines to run while the boat remained submerged, came late, and its fitment was a measure of desperation as much as ingenuity. By the time every possible adaptation had been made, the Type VIIC was a different boat to look at, and a similar boat to fight in, facing threats that its original designers had not imagined and could not have provided for. What the class achieved, in aggregate, was extraordinary by any measure of naval history. What it cost is equally extraordinary and demands equal weight. The Type VIIC became the defining instrument of the Battle of the Atlantic, pressed into a campaign of attrition against Allied supply lines that came genuinely close, in the early years, to severing Britain's ability to fight. Then that same instrument was used up, crew by crew, boat by boat, in a campaign that its own commanders eventually knew could not be won, continued long past the point when survival had replaced victory as the measure of success. U-995 was built into this class, shaped by its philosophy, constrained by its limits, and ultimately preserved as its sole surviving representative. To understand the boat, you have to understand the design. To understand the design, you have to understand that it was both a remarkable achievement and, for the men who took it to sea, an instrument of a war that devoured them. Hamburg in the early years of the war was a city that never slept. Along the southern bank of the Elbe, where the river runs wide and brown and cold, the Blom and Foss shipyard stretched across the waterfront in a controlled disorder of cranes, dry docks, and fabrication sheds that seemed to breathe with the effort of a nation building toward a future it had promised itself. Smoke rose from the foundries, in the pale northern mornings. The smell of hot steel and cutting oil drifted through the streets of Steinwerder. Workers arrived at the yard gates in the pre-dawn dark, hundreds of them at each shift change, tradesmen and apprentices and engineers and welders, moving through a complex that had been producing vessels of every kind for more than half a century. By the early 1940s, however, the yard had been remade almost entirely in the image of one particular need. Blom und Voss was building U-boats, and it was doing so at a pace that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. The contract for U-995 was one of dozens being processed through the Kriegsmarine's construction bureaucracy during this period, part of the enormous expansion program that Karl Dönitz had pushed for since before the war began, and that the German state had finally committed to funding in earnest. Serial production of the Type VIIC had been refined through hard experience with earlier hulls, and by the time U-995's keel was laid, the process at Blom und Voss carried the rhythm of a practiced industrial routine. Prefabricated pressure hull sections were manufactured in separate workshops, rolled and formed and welded under controlled conditions before being brought together at the building slip. The modular approach, a deliberate choice to accelerate output, meant that multiple boats could be progressed simultaneously at different stages of assembly, each one moving through the yard like an item on a production line that happened to be measured not in hours, but in months. It was engineering at a scale that required not just skilled hands, but a precise choreography of materials, tools, schedules, and human expertise, arriving at the right place at the right time. The workers who built U-995 were not a faceless mass. They were Hamburg men and women, skilled tradespeople who had grown up in a city built around the sea and the ships that crossed it. Many of them had fathers and grandfathers who had worked these same yards, who had built merchant vessels and warships under the old Kaiser, who had known the enforced idleness of the interwar slump and the quiet shame of a great industrial facility with little to do. By the early 1940s, the idleness was gone, decisively, overwhelmingly gone, but in its place came pressures of a different kind. Quotas were imposed from above, timelines were shortened. The Kriegsmarine needed boats, and it needed them before the strategic window that Dönitz believed existed had closed. Every foreman in every shed carried that urgency in his posture, in the way he moved through the work gangs calling for speed, checking tolerances, signing off on each completed weld before the next section moved into position. The pressure hull itself demanded absolute precision. A Type VIIC submarine was designed to dive to depths that the steel itself had to be trusted absolutely to survive. And in those curved pressure hull sections, rolled and formed and checked against exacting templates, the margin for error was nearly non-existent. A flawed weld, an improperly formed frame, a section of hull plate that had been cut even fractionally outside tolerance. Any of these things could become fatal at depth, not through dramatic catastrophe, but through the slow ingress of water at a pressure that no human effort could reverse. The men who worked the hull sections knew this. The welders who ran their beads along the circumferential frames knew that somewhere, in some year not yet determined, their work would be tested by the ocean in a way no inspection stamp could fully anticipate. There was a particular kind of seriousness in that knowledge, a craft consciousness that sat alongside the institutional pressure to build faster, that said, fast is one thing, but it must also hold. Once the primary hull sections were joined and the overall form of the boat established on the slip, the installation of machinery began in earnest. The twin-man diesel engines that would drive the boat on the surface were lowered through hull openings with millimeter precision. Each engine, a substantial mass of cast iron and machined steel that had to be aligned with a propeller shaft running the full length of the aft section. The electric motors for submerged running were paired with the diesels through a drive arrangement that had to function smoothly under conditions of vibration, saltwater ingress, and temperature extremes that no land-based machinery ever had to endure. Banks of lead-acid storage batteries, enormously heavy and potentially lethal if seawater reached them and produced chlorine gas, were lowered into the hull in their hundreds and secured in their dedicated compartments below the decking. The torpedo tubes were fitted forward and aft, their breech mechanisms checked and checked again. Every system was interconnected with every other: fuel, ballast, compressed air, hydraulics, electrical supply, in a web of piping and cabling that, once the interior fit-out was complete, left almost no unoccupied volume inside the pressure hull at all. Against this relentless industrial effort, the skies above Hamburg were beginning to change. The Allies had identified German shipbuilding infrastructure as a strategic target, and although the major area bombing campaigns that would eventually reduce much of the city to rubble still lay ahead, the early raids were already making themselves felt. Air raid warnings interrupted work shifts. Men paused at the sound of aircraft engines and looked upward through the open roofs of the fabrication sheds. Concrete blast walls had been raised around key workshops, and provisions were made for the rapid concealment or protection of partially assembled hulls during raid conditions. The workers moved between their tasks and the air raid shelters with a practiced calm that was not indifference but adaptation, the learned behavior of a population that had incorporated threat into the structure of the working day and decided to continue regardless. There was institutional pride in the commissioning of each new boat, but it coexisted with something more complicated. The men who built U-995 knew, in the way that people in wartime always know things they are not officially told, that the boats they were producing were going into a war that was consuming crews at a rate no construction program could offset. Photographs taken at launch ceremonies during this period show the faces of shipyard workers in the background, not triumphant faces necessarily, but attentive ones. People watching something they made cross from the world of construction into the world of consequence. The boat was no longer theirs the moment she touched the water. She became something else: a weapon, a home, a potential grave, a number in a registry that would one day be crossed out. U-995 was launched at the Blom und Voss yard, sliding into the Elbe in the manner of all her sister boats before her, the hull moving down the greased slip with gathering momentum, the bow cutting the brown river water and sending a wake back against the dock walls, the mooring lines coming taut as she found her first waterborne equilibrium. A launch is not a completion. The boat that entered the Elbe that day was a hull, structurally assembled but functionally incomplete, requiring weeks more of dockside work before she would carry anything resembling a fighting capability. But a launch is a threshold, and those who watched it understood what had been crossed. What had been steel and plans and labor on a Hamburg slip was now a vessel, displacing water, claiming the river as her first element. The final fitting-out phase brought tradesmen back aboard for the installation of navigational equipment, communications gear, optical instruments, and the 100 smaller details of a fighting ship's interior that could not be completed until the main structure was sound and the machinery installed. The hydroplane controls were tested and adjusted. The periscope housings were sealed and checked for integrity. The galley, a space so small it seemed almost satirical in proportion to the number of men it was meant to serve, was fitted out with its basic equipment. Bunks were installed in the compartments fore and aft, fewer of them than the crew roster demanded, because men would sleep in shifts in an arrangement the crew would learn to navigate by necessity rather than comfort. The torpedo storage racks were fitted and checked for the loads they would carry. One by one, each system was brought to the standard that the Kriegsmarine's acceptance procedures required, and one by one, the relevant authorities signed their names against the relevant entries in the construction record. The commissioning ceremony for U-995 was a formal occasion, as such events were intended to be. The Kriegsmarine flag hoisted, the crew assembled on the casing in their best uniforms, a commanding officer receiving the boat on behalf of the service. These ceremonies carried weight regardless of how many times they had been performed, because they marked the moment at which an industrial product became a commissioned warship, and the men aboard her became accountable for it, in the way that only a naval commission makes a crew accountable. The commanding officer stood before his men on a boat he had not yet taken to sea, a boat he did not yet know, in the intimate sense that only sea time teaches, and he accepted her on behalf of a navy that needed her and of a war that would not wait. What none of those men standing in their harbour-pressed uniforms could fully hold in mind was the scale of the enterprise they were joining. The Blom und Voss yards had built boats before U-995 and would build boats after her, each one commissioned under the same formal structure, each one entering the same widening war. Across Germany's other major shipyards, in Bremen, in Kiel, in Danzig, the same process was playing out in parallel, an industrial effort producing submarines at a tempo that only made sense if you believed the losses could be sustained. The men who built U-995 had done their work well. The welds would hold, the tolerances had been met, the machinery would run. But a well-built boat is not the same as a safe one, and the sea, and the forces now arrayed above it and beneath it, would establish that distinction on their own terms, in waters very far from the brown Elbe and the smoking Hamburg yards. Before a U-boat could go to war, she had to be broken in, and so did her men. The commissioning ceremony at Blom und Voss had given U-995 a name, a number, and a crew, but it had given her nothing resembling a fighting vessel yet. That transformation would take months, and it would happen not in the Atlantic, not in the Arctic, but in the cold, relatively sheltered waters of the Baltic Sea, a body of water that, by 1943, had become one of the most intensively used submarine training grounds in the world. The Kriegsmarine had built its workup program here for a reason. The Baltic offered enclosed waters, known depths, predictable weather by comparison to the open ocean, and, critically, the absence of Allied anti-submarine forces. It was a protected environment for learning, and the learning that took place there was serious, systematic, and unrelenting. For U-995 and her crew, the Baltic was not a respite from war. It was the anteroom to it. The workup program that awaited them was known as the Ausbildungsgruppe Frontboote, the training group for frontline boats, and it had been refined through years of hard operational experience into a structured sequence of tests, exercises, and evaluations. Nothing was left to informal instruction or individual initiative. The program ran in stages, beginning with basic acceptance trials that verified the boat herself was mechanically sound after leaving the builder's hands, and progressing through increasingly demanding tactical exercises. The boat would be dived and surfaced dozens of times in the first weeks alone, her systems checked and rechecked, her crew learning the particular mechanical personality of this specific hull. Every U-boat was the same class, the same blueprint, and yet every boat had its own temperament, valves that stuck, gauges that lagged, a diesel that ran rough at certain revolutions. The crew had to learn U-995 the way a rider learns a horse, not from the manual, but from hours of repetition and close attention to what the machine was telling them. The crash dive drill was perhaps the single most repeated exercise of the entire workup period, and for good reason. In operational waters, the difference between a crash dive completed in 35 seconds and one completed in 50 seconds could be the difference between survival and destruction from an attacking aircraft. The drill was simple to describe and brutal to perfect. The moment the alarm klaxon sounded, every man on the bridge dropped through the hatch, the watch officer last, sealing it above him as he fell. Below, the diesel engines were cut, the electric motors engaged, the ballast tanks flooded, and the boat driven down at a steep angle by the hydroplanes. Every man had an assigned station and an assigned action, and those actions had to be completed in sequence, without hesitation, without error, and without the luxury of a second thought. In the early weeks, the times were embarrassing. The hatches fumbled. The diesels were slow to disengage. Men collided in the narrow companionway. The drills were run again and again and again, until the sequence stopped being a conscious procedure and became something closer to reflex, a collective physical memory shared by 40-odd men who had rehearsed it until it lived in their muscles rather than their minds. Torpedo exercises followed their own logic. Loading practice, targeting calculations, approach geometry, firing solutions, all of it had to be absorbed by the officers responsible for putting weapons on target, and the torpedo men who would handle the weapons themselves. The forward torpedo room of a Type VIIC was a confined, greasy, mechanically demanding space where large and unforgiving pieces of equipment had to be manipulated with precision by men working in close quarters, with almost no margin for error. A torpedo was not merely a weapon. It was a complex machine with its own propulsion system, depth-keeping mechanism, and, depending on type, a magnetic or contact fuse that required careful preparation. Handling them incorrectly could be fatal. The wartime record of U-boat crews killed by their own weapons through premature detonations or circle-running torpedoes was a sobering part of the institutional knowledge that instructors did not hesitate to share with trainees. The exercises in the Baltic used practice weapons, but the discipline expected was identical to combat conditions. A missed firing solution was reviewed, critiqued, and repeated. The standard was not competence, it was consistency. Navigation training ran in parallel, and it placed its own demands on officers who would one day have to fix a position in the North Atlantic with no landmarks, limited star sights through broken cloud, and the constant anxiety of enemy direction-finding stations. In the Baltic, at least, coastal references were available, and the mathematics could be verified against reality. The navigation officer, and in many cases, the captain himself, spent hours at the chart table, working through dead reckoning exercises, celestial observations, and the use of the boat's limited instruments. The Baltic's relatively shallow and variable depths also gave the boat's sonar operator early experience, reading the acoustic environment, the way temperature layers bent sound, the way the seabed returned echoes that could be misread as contacts. These subtleties would matter enormously when U-995 moved into waters where a misidentified contact could send a crew plunging toward a depth charge or, equally dangerous, toward a sandbank at speed. Damage control procedures occupied a place in the training calendar that the instructors treated with particular gravity, because the scenarios they described were ones that survivors had actually lived through. A pressure hull breach at depth, a fire in the motor room, a flooded torpedo tube with the bow dive already steepening. The crew were not trained merely to respond to these emergencies. They were trained to respond to them while simultaneously managing the boat's trim, maintaining depth control, and communicating clearly to the captain what the situation actually was, rather than what they wished it to be. The psychological component of damage control training was as important as the procedural one. An engineer who lost composure when cold seawater began sheeting through a cracked fitting would kill everyone aboard. The drills were designed to be stressful because the reality they imitated was nearly incomprehensible in its violence and speed. Men who panicked in a simulated emergency were identified early. What happened to them varied, but the boat could not accommodate passengers. Through all of this, the crew were also learning something that no training syllabus could formally teach: how to live together. The interior of a Type VIIC U-boat offered approximately 750 tons of displacement, spread across roughly 67 meters of length, and within that space, somewhere between 40 and 50 men had to eat, sleep, work, and exist for weeks at a time. The reality was a continuous negotiation with physical discomfort. Bunks were shared in rotation, a practice known to crews as the hot bunk system, where a man climbing into his berth would find it still warm from the body of whoever had just been called to watch. Personal space was measured in centimeters. Privacy was essentially a theoretical concept. The smell of the boat, diesel fuel, machine grease, unwashed bodies, damp clothing, and the particular metallic exhalation of the bilges was something that newcomers found overwhelming, and veterans had simply ceased to register. A detail that said something important about the adaptive capacity of the men who served in these boats. The culture that emerged from this enforced proximity had its own character, and dark humor was its dominant register. Submarine crews across all navies have tended toward a particular brand of gallows wit, and the men of the Kriegsmarine U-boat arm were no exception. The jokes tended to run in a familiar direction, about the absurdity of their situation, about the unreliability of equipment, about the gap between the propaganda version of submarine warfare and the lived version, about death, which was never far enough away to be entirely comfortable as a subject. This humor was not trivial. It was a coping mechanism and a social bond simultaneously, a way of acknowledging the danger without being overwhelmed by it, and a way of testing new men to see whether they could carry the weight of what they had chosen. A man who could not laugh about the depth gauges, or the food, or the cramped misery of a long submerged run, was a man who would eventually be a problem for everyone around him. The food, for what it was worth, was generous by wartime standards. The Kriegsmarine made a deliberate policy of provisioning U-boats well, partly out of genuine concern for operational effectiveness, and partly because the institution understood, at some level, that men being sent on missions with survival rates declining by the month deserved to eat properly. In the early weeks of a patrol, the fresh provisions lasted: bread, sausage, vegetables stored wherever a gap could be found between the torpedoes and the bunks. As weeks passed, the fresh food was exhausted, and the men moved to preserved rations, which were nutritionally adequate and gastronomically monotonous. During the Baltic workup, the food was the least of anyone's concerns. The men were burning energy at a rate that left them hungry regardless, and the communal ritual of mealtimes, however improvised the setting, however cramped the mess table, was one of the anchors of daily routine that kept the social fabric of the crew intact. The commanding officer occupied a position in this world that had no real civilian equivalent. He was responsible for the boat, the crew, and every decision made, in conditions where the available information was always incomplete and the consequences of error were absolute. During the workup period, the captain of U-995 was learning his own version of the same lessons his crew was absorbing, not mechanical procedures, but the specific feel of command in an environment where authority and physical proximity existed in constant, unusual tension. He could not retreat to a separate office. He could not maintain a formal distance. He ate the same food, breathed the same recycled air, and heard the same noises. And yet the distance between his responsibility and that of every man under him was immeasurable. The workup months were his opportunity to discover which of his men would function under pressure and which would need to be managed, and it was the crew's opportunity to discover what kind of captain they had been given. By the time U-995 completed her Baltic training program and was declared ready for frontline operations, she was no longer the raw machine that had slid off the blocks at Blom und Voss. Her crew had been welded into something coherent and functional by months of repetition, discomfort, and shared experience. They had learned the boat, and they had learned each other, which in the world of submarine warfare were nearly the same thing. They did not yet know what the Atlantic would ask of them, or the Arctic. They did not know what those waters looked like from 40 meters below the surface, with depth charges detonating close enough to fracture light bulbs and knock men off their feet. That knowledge was ahead of them, waiting with absolute patience. For now, they had done what could be done in sheltered waters under an institutional program designed by men who had already survived what they were being prepared to face. The Baltic had given them the foundations. What was built on those foundations would depend on everything that came next, and what came next would be nothing like any drill they had rehearsed. There was a time, not so many years before U-995 ever touched open water, when German submarine commanders returned from patrol, wearing the wide, unguarded grins of men who could not quite believe their own luck. The early years of the war in the Atlantic had produced something the Kriegsmarine submariners called the happy time, a period when Allied convoy defenses were thin, radar barely existed in useful form, and a bold commander could surface at night inside a convoy column and fire torpedoes almost at leisure. Tonnage went down in extraordinary quantities. Signals flooded back to shore headquarters, claiming kills that ran to hundreds of thousands of tons per month. Crews came home to cheering dock workers and the Iron Cross, pinned by gloved hands in harbor ceremonies. It was a war that seemed, from the U-boat arms perspective, almost embarrassingly winnable. That period was over. By the time U-995 finished her Baltic workup and was declared operationally ready, it was gone so completely that veterans of those early cruises could barely describe it without sounding like men recounting a fever dream. What remained in its place was a different kind of war entirely, grimmer, more technological, and far more lethal to the men who waged it from below. The year 1943 is the fulcrum on which the entire Battle of the Atlantic turns, and no honest account of U-9. In the opening months of that year, Karl Dönitz, who had recently been elevated to Commander-in-Chief of the entire German Navy, still commanded a U-boat fleet of considerable size. More than 400 submarines were in commission across all theaters. The tonnage war, the fundamental German strategic logic of sinking Allied cargo faster than it could be replaced, still seemed arithmetically possible to some planners inside the Naval High Command. Wolf-Pack tactics, the coordinated group attacks that Dönitz had developed and refined through the Middle War years, were still extracting a serious price from convoy routes across the North Atlantic. In March of 1943, German submarines achieved some of their highest single-month sinking totals of the entire conflict. On the surface of the numbers, the arm looked powerful. Beneath the surface, in every meaningful sense, it was already fracturing. The problem was not one single development, but the convergence of several, arriving together in a way that multiplied their individual effects into something close to catastrophic. Allied convoy escort doctrine had been steadily professionalized across 2 years of hard operational experience. The Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy had built dedicated escort groups, not simply vessels assigned piecemeal to convoy duty, but trained teams who operated together repeatedly, developed shared procedures, and accumulated the kind of institutional knowledge that comes only from doing something dangerous many times and surviving. These groups had learned how to hold contact on a submerged U-boat across hours, rotating their vessels, maintaining pressure, denying the submarine any opportunity to creep away and surface for the air and battery charge it desperately needed. What had once been a matter of dropping a pattern of depth charges and hoping for the best had become a disciplined, methodical craft. The U-boats were being hunted by men who had become very good at hunting them. At the same time, the air gap, that critical stretch of mid-Atlantic Ocean beyond the reach of land-based patrol aircraft, was closing. This gap had been the U-boat's most reliable sanctuary, a belt of open water where a submarine could surface, charge batteries, and move freely without fear of the sudden aircraft attack that caused more psychological terror than almost any other threat. Long-range patrol aircraft, modified bombers fitted with additional fuel tanks and sent on grinding 17-hour patrols, were beginning to reach further into that gap than ever before. Escort carriers, small, utilitarian ships built around a flight deck and little else, were being assigned directly to convoy groups, bringing anti-submarine aircraft to the precise waters where the submarines were operating. The roof was coming down on a space that had once felt, if not safe, then at least survivable. The radar revolution is perhaps the most quietly devastating development of this entire period, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. Earlier in the war, U-boats had been fitted with receivers designed to detect Allied radar transmissions and give crews time to dive before an attacking aircraft could close to attack range. These receivers worked adequately against the longer wavelength radar sets the Allies had been using. Then came centimetric radar, operating on wavelengths so short that the existing German detection equipment could not hear them at all. An aircraft, equipped with centimetric radar, could illuminate a surfaced U-boat, make its attack run, and be almost overhead before the crew on the conning tower had any warning at all. Submarines that had navigated 2 years of war by relying on their receivers as an early warning system suddenly had no reliable warning system at all. The night, which had always been the U-boat commander's ally, had been taken from them by a technology so compact it could be fitted into a patrol aircraft, and so precise it could detect a submarine's conning tower from several kilometers away in complete darkness. High-frequency direction finding, which British and American naval personnel called HFDUF, and which they operated from escort vessels as well as shore stations, compounded the radar problem in ways that were operationally devastating. When a U-boat transmitted a radio signal, a contact report on a convoy sighting, a position update for headquarters, a weather observation, that transmission could be triangulated almost instantly. 2 or more ships equipped with direction-finding receivers could cross their bearings within seconds and pass a position to an attacking aircraft or an escort. The Wolfpack system depended entirely on radio communication. Submarines had to talk to each other and to shore to coordinate their attacks. Every time they talked, they revealed themselves. It was as though someone had fitted every submarine with a flare that fired automatically whenever the crew opened their mouths. In May of 1943, all of these pressures converged into a single catastrophic month that the U-boat arm would never recover from in any meaningful operational sense. 41 German submarines were lost in a period of 30 days, a figure so high that even the most committed institutional optimists inside naval headquarters could not frame it as acceptable attrition. Crews that represented hundreds of thousands of man-hours of training and experience went down across the Atlantic in a single month. Donitz, facing numbers that no strategic calculation could absorb, ordered his surviving boats to withdraw temporarily from the North Atlantic convoy routes. He called it a tactical repositioning. His submariners called it what it was, a defeat. U-995 was still being finished in Hamburg when that order went out. She was commissioned into a service that had just suffered the worst month in its entire operational history. Dönitz did not abandon the campaign. He could not. The strategic logic of the tonnage war, however frayed, remained official German policy, and the admiral had built his entire professional identity around the submarine arm. He publicly promised that new technologies would restore the balance: better radar receivers, more powerful anti-aircraft guns fitted to U-boat conning towers to fight back against aircraft rather than diving away from them, acoustic torpedoes that could home on the propeller noise of escort vessels, and eventually the schnorkel breathing mast that would allow extended submerged operation. Some of these solutions arrived in time to reach U-995 during her operational life. None of them restored the balance. What they did was extend the contest, raising the cost of Allied operations at sea, while simultaneously failing to reduce German losses to a level the arm could sustain. The technology race was real, but it was a race in which the Allies had both the lead and the greater industrial capacity to stay ahead. What the official accounts of this period tend to understate is what it meant psychologically for the men being sent to sea in the summer and autumn of 1943. The U-boat arm had always suffered losses. It was inherently one of the most dangerous forms of warfare that existed, but there had been a kind of grim professional confidence in earlier years that skill and aggression could shift the odds in a crew's favor. By mid-1943, that confidence had been replaced by statistical knowledge that was almost impossible to live with. Experienced crews calculated their own odds privately. Men who had come through the early Atlantic patrols understood that the conditions that had kept them alive no longer existed. The boats kept leaving harbor, and the boats kept not coming back, and the men who remained in the service continued to go through the motions of a profession that had become something close to institutional suicide, dressed in naval uniform. Replacement crews were younger, trained faster, and sent out with less accumulated experience than any previous generation of German submariners. The men who had developed the most reliable instincts for survival, when to dive, when to hold depth, when to run, and when to fight, were largely dead or captured. Their replacements were taught procedures and given the same boats and sent to the same waters. But procedures are not instincts, and the gap between the two became lethal with painful regularity. U-995 carried a crew that was neither the rawest nor the most experienced cohort the arm was producing at this moment in the war, but they were young men carrying the weight of a statistical record that their service did its best not to broadcast openly, and that circulated anyway in the way that terrible truths always do among people whose lives depend on knowing them. When U-995 finally pointed her bow toward the open sea on her first operational patrol, she was not departing into the war her commanders had originally promised the arm would win. She was departing into a contest that had already been decided at the strategic level, though that decision would take another 2 years to work itself fully into historical record. The wolf packs were thinner, the escort groups were stronger, the aircraft were more numerous, their radar invisible to existing detection equipment, their crews increasingly skilled in the particular craft of killing submarines. The ocean that U-995 entered was the same ocean that her predecessors had crossed in the early years of the conflict, grey-green and vast and indifferent. What had changed, completely and irrevocably, was everything that happened on and beneath that surface. She sailed out, carrying the hopes of a command structure that was still publicly committed to eventual victory, into waters where the balance of probability had already made its own quiet calculation and arrived at a very different answer. She left the fjord in the grey hours before dawn, running on the surface, her diesel engines turning the black water white behind her. The Norwegian coast fell away into the mist, granite cliffs, cold pines, the distant suggestion of a world that still had solid ground in it. Aboard U-995, the men on the bridge watch stood in their oilskins and said very little. There was a protocol to departure, a set of procedures that gave the hands something to do besides think about what lay ahead. Below decks, those off-watch slept in whatever spaces they could find, or pretended to. The first patrol began not with ceremony, but with the slow, specific weight of a boat moving out of protected water into open sea, and every man aboard understood the difference between the two. The passage north and west from Norwegian waters carried its own particular dangers before U-95 had even reached the open Atlantic. The transit zones were contested airspace, swept regularly by British patrol aircraft, operating from bases in Scotland and Iceland. The routine on the bridge was one of constant, exhausting vigilance. 4 men scanning assigned sectors of sky and sea, their binoculars never still, their concentration absolute and time-limited, because no human being could sustain that quality of attention for longer than a watch. The standing order was simple and total. Any aircraft contact meant an immediate crash dive. No deliberation, no waiting to identify the type or assess the threat. A Type VIIC submarine running on the surface could be attacked from aircraft altitude before her crew had time to think. Speed was the only variable the crew controlled, and they practiced it until the sequence was reflex. Below the surface, the world shrank to the dimensions of the pressure hull, and those dimensions were extraordinary in their smallness. U-995 measured roughly 67 meters in length, but crew living space occupied a fraction of that. The rest belonged to machinery, weapons, fuel, and the endless engineering infrastructure that kept the boat alive. A man walking from the bow torpedo room to the stern had to turn sideways through hatchways, step over sleeping crewmates, navigate around pipe runs and valve clusters, and hanging gear. There was no concept of personal space in any meaningful sense. Privacy did not exist. And into this sealed, lightless, diesel-scented world, the crew descended for extended periods when the threat above demanded it, breathing recycled air that grew heavier and more stale with each hour, listening to the sounds of a sea they could not see pressing against the hull a few centimeters from their faces. The daily rhythm of a war patrol settled quickly into a pattern that was simultaneously grinding and hypnotic. On the surface, the watches rotated through their cycles. Bridge watch, engine room watch, torpedo crew standby, navigation plots updated on the hour. Meals appeared at intervals from the tiny galley, the cook performing small miracles of improvisation with whatever the provisioning had allowed. In the early days of a patrol, the food was relatively fresh. As the weeks accumulated, it became progressively more preserved, more monotonous, and more contested by the mold and damp that infiltrated everything aboard. Men slept when they could, in their clothes, in their boots sometimes, in bunks that were often shared on a rotation because there were more crew members than berths. Sleep became a skill, and a good submariner learned to achieve it quickly, completely, and in any position the boat allowed. The hunt for convoys in the North Atlantic of 1943 was a fundamentally different proposition from what it had been 2 or 3 years earlier, and U-995's first patrol unfolded against that strategic reality at every moment. BDU headquarters transmitted operational orders and contact reports by encrypted radio signal, directing boats toward areas where convoy traffic was expected or confirmed. But the convoys that had once been found and attacked with something approaching impunity were now moving inside a defensive architecture of considerable sophistication. Escort groups of destroyers and corvettes screened the merchant columns. Escort carriers had begun to close the mid-Atlantic air gap that had previously been a sanctuary for U-boats. High-frequency direction-finding equipment aboard escort vessels could fix a submarine's transmitting position within minutes of a radio signal leaving the antenna. The ocean had become smaller, in a very specific and dangerous sense, for the boats that hunted it. Watchkeepers on U-995's bridge became students of the sky in a way that had no peacetime equivalent. They learned to read the horizon not for its beauty, but for the tiny dark speck against cloud that could resolve within seconds into an attacking aircraft. Pilots of the British Maritime Patrol squadrons had developed their own techniques, approaching from the sun when conditions allowed, using cloud cover, holding their altitude to delay the moment of detection. The result was a constant psychological pressure on the bridge watch that accumulated across weeks at sea and could not be discharged. Men who had been steady and professional in Baltic training found that the real patrol demanded something beyond what training had prepared them for. Not different skills, but the same skills sustained under a weight of anxiety that never fully lifted. Between dives they surfaced. Between surfacings they dove. The boat breathed with the threat level, and the crew breathed with the boat. Submerged running brought its own specific ordeal. To conserve the battery capacity that sustained the electric motors and kept life support systems functioning, a submerged boat typically moved at minimum speed, slow enough that the crew could feel the ocean pressing in rather than passing by. Sound carried clearly through the hull in ways it did not on the surface. Propeller noises from distant ships, the ping of an ASDIC sonar searching, the ambient groaning of the hull under pressure. These were the soundtrack of an existence that left very little psychological room for anything but acute awareness of the vessel's condition. Depth charges, when they came, were not merely alarming. They were physical events that slammed against the hull like hammer blows, extinguished lights, burst pipe fittings, threw men from their stations, and filled compartments with acrid smoke from blown electrical connections. Even near misses caused damage. Even distant explosions wore men down. The question of what to do when no convoy appeared was one that every U-boat crew had to answer across the long middle stretches of a patrol. They waited. They maintained their assigned patrol zone, executing the search patterns that BDU directed, surfacing to recharge batteries and transmit position reports, diving again when the sky demanded it. The ocean was vast, and the intelligence that guided them was imperfect. Convoys took routes that varied, sailed at speeds that confounded prediction, and were sometimes rerouted specifically to avoid areas where German submarines were known or suspected to be operating. A consequence, though U-995's crew had no way of knowing it, of intelligence that reached Allied convoy planners from sources deep inside the German signal system. The boat searched. The ocean offered nothing. Days accumulated into weeks, and the patrol became a sustained exercise in professional patience that was really a kind of slow endurance. There were moments of contact, the sighting of smoke on the horizon, the brief, electric transformation of a watch into something urgent and purposeful, the orders flowing through the boat as stations were manned and approach procedures initiated. These moments carried all the tension that the long, empty stretches had banked and deferred. But the defended convoys of the late war were not targets that could be attacked straightforwardly. Escort vessels responded quickly. Aircraft appeared with a speed that forced dives before firing positions could be achieved. The geometry of an attack run that might have succeeded in 1941 required a different calculation in 1943. Longer, more patient, more frequently interrupted and aborted. The approach became an act of calculation against forces that were increasingly well coordinated and professionally aggressive in their response. Whether U-995 achieved any confirmed results on her first patrol is not recorded with the specificity that would allow a confident account. What can be said with accuracy is that first patrols for Type VIIC boats operating in this period frequently returned without confirmed sinkings, not because their crews failed in their duty or their nerve, but because the environment in which they operated had been transformed by Allied countermeasures into one where mere survival constituted a form of operational success. The boat that came home, however empty her torpedo tubes remained, was a boat whose experienced crew could fight another patrol. In the mathematics of a war going badly for the U-boat arm, that was not nothing. It was, in fact, very close to everything. The return to the Norwegian fjord was its own kind of ceremony, stripped of any triumph. The crew was exhausted in the specific way that weeks of broken sleep and chronic anxiety produce. Not tired exactly, but hollowed out, the edges of things slightly uncertain. Appetite and appetite's opposite, alternating without pattern. The boats smelled of themselves, of diesel, of the particular compound of human occupation and mechanical labor that no amount of time at sea fully normalized. They tied up, and the shoreside personnel came aboard to assess the boat's condition, to begin the cycle of maintenance and replenishment that would eventually send U-95 back out. The men who stepped onto the pier and felt solid ground under their boots stood quietly for a moment, in a way that required no explanation. They had gone out. They had come back. In 1943, in the North Atlantic, that was the whole story, and it was a story that fewer and fewer boats were able to tell. By the spring of 1943, when U-995 had completed her workup in the Baltic and stood ready for operational deployment, the strategic map of the U-boat war had undergone a profound realignment. The Atlantic was no longer the primary hunting ground for German submarines. The convoy routes that had seemed to offer unlimited targets 2 years earlier had become killing grounds for the hunters themselves. The tonnage sunk per U-boat lost had inverted. Losses were mounting faster than replacements could sustain them. The Kriegsmarine's High Command faced a choice between withdrawing U-boats from the Atlantic entirely to regroup and retrain, or redirecting them to theaters where Allied defenses were thinner and German strategic interests still burned with urgency. They chose the north. There, along the desolate fjords of occupied Norway and in the frozen waters beyond, lay a target that no amount of Allied air superiority over the Atlantic could yet fully protect. The Arctic convoys, bound for Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, carrying the industrial sinews of the Western Alliance directly into Soviet hands. The strategic logic was ruthless and clear. While Germany fought on the Western Front and prepared for the invasion she knew must come, the Soviet Union was being rebuilt by American trucks, British tanks, and hundreds of thousands of tons of munitions, food, and machinery. Every convoy that made it through the Arctic Passage represented a direct addition to Soviet capacity to wage war against Germany. The Murmansk route was the shortest sea lane connecting the Western democracies to their communist ally, cutting through waters that, by virtue of geography and climate, remained partially beyond the reach of Allied air power. For months at a time, the Arctic experienced total darkness, or near total darkness. For other months, perpetual daylight. The transition between these extremes lasted only weeks. This extreme environment, hostile as it was to human life, created windows of opportunity, moments when submarines could operate with reduced threat from aircraft, when ice floes could provide concealment, when the very brutality of the sea might grant a U-boat the anonymity it needed to hunt. The German Naval Command was not wrong to identify it as a frontier where the submarine arm might yet accomplish something. U-995 was among the U-boats selected for this Arctic redeployment. The journey from Norwegian ports into the icebound waters beyond was not a journey into an unknown region, but it was a journey into an entirely different kind of war. The Atlantic was vast, but relatively stable. The Arctic was claustrophobic in a different way. The space was narrower, the escape routes fewer. The consequences of a depth charge hit more likely to be fatal, when the nearest friendly port might be hundreds of kilometers away, across open water, or blocked by ice. The route that carried U-95 northward wound through the Norwegian fjords, those deep cuts of water that sliced inland between vertical cliffs of grey rock. In places, the fjords were scarcely wider than the U-boat was long. A commander had to know his waters, or surrender to them. Ice clung to the rocks in winter. Waterfalls fell from cliff faces in summer and spring. The bases themselves, places like Narvik, Tromsø, and the deep pens at Harstad, were less like the organized naval establishments of the Reich, and more like outposts of an empire stretched too thin, held together by routine, and the iron discipline of men who knew the alternative was chaos. The physical environment of the Arctic was categorically harsher than anything the boat or her crew had encountered in the Atlantic. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below 0 Celsius on the surface, and the cold that seeped into the boat's steel hull transformed her interior into something that required not just endurance, but a kind of resigned stoicism. The diesel engines that powered U-995 on the surface had to be heated before they could start in these conditions. Oil thickened to the consistency of paste. Seals and gaskets became brittle and leaked. The men who worked in the engine rooms wore multiple layers of clothing that restricted their movement and left them soaked with perspiration, only to step through a hatch and face cold so intense it could stop breath. Above water, on the deck and conning tower, watch officers and lookouts endured conditions that transformed frostbite from a hazard into a mathematical certainty. Fingers went numb within minutes. Men's breath froze on their faces. The spray that washed over the hull in heavy seas turned to ice that accumulated faster than it could be chipped away, adding weight that pulled the boat lower in the water and threatened her buoyancy. Yet it was the darkness and the light that most disoriented the crews. In winter, the Arctic night lasted for weeks at a time. There came a period when no sun rose. The world was a greyness that pressed against the boat from every direction, a perpetual twilight that confused the body's sense of time and drained the mind of something it had not known it needed. Clocks became irrelevant. A watch lasted 4 hours, or 6, or 8, depending on the captain's judgment and the operational situation. Men slept when there was time to sleep, ate when food was distributed, and worked through a haze of fatigue that became normal enough that its absence would have seemed strange. Then the season would turn, the darkness would lift, and within a few weeks, there came a period of perpetual daylight, the midnight sun hanging above the horizon at 0200 hours in the morning, casting no shadows, creating a landscape of surreal clarity where every feature was visible, and every U-boat on the surface was visible too. The human body evolved over millennia to sleep in darkness and wake in light, became confused and unreliable. Men hallucinated, their judgment deteriorated. Some became prone to sudden rage. Others sank into a listlessness that had to be managed carefully by officers who understood that morale was a physical thing that could simply drain away if the conditions were not attended to. The sea itself in the Arctic operated according to different rules. The North Atlantic, for all its fury, obeyed relatively predictable patterns. Storms came from the west. Winds had seasonal preferences. A U-boat captain, who had experience with Atlantic weather, could anticipate and plan. The Arctic was a chaos of local conditions, created by the interaction between open ocean, pack ice, and the extreme temperature differences between the water and the air above it. Waves that would be large in the Atlantic became mountainous in the Arctic because they had no time to dissipate. They were contained and amplified by the surrounding ice. A U-boat running on the surface in heavy Arctic seas was in constant danger of being rolled. A submarine that was meant to dive remained on the surface because the ice above made it a trap. The boat could slip under the floes and be unable to find an open lead to surface through. The ice itself was predatory. It crept across the sea surface as the water temperature dropped. It closed around islands and headlands. It made navigation a matter of constant calculation and carried always the possibility of sudden entrapment. Men who had been trained to fear depth and pressure in the Atlantic now had to fear something equally tangible, being crushed by the weight of frozen water above their heads, or being locked into a fjord and shelled by artillery they could not reach. The convoys themselves, that U-995 and her sister boats hunted, were defended with a sophistication that reflected their strategic importance. The Murmansk convoys were not lightly protected merchant ships sailing in loose formation with a destroyer or two. They were heavily escorted, often by British warships that had themselves come north for the purpose, supported by aircraft that flew from shore bases or from escort carriers that had been specially modified to operate in these latitudes. The British learned quickly that the Arctic convoys could not be won by superior numbers alone. They had to be won by superior understanding of the environment. They developed tactics for the Arctic that were distinct from Atlantic convoy procedures. They used ice as a natural barrier when they could. They timed convoy departures to minimize the periods of perpetual daylight when U-boats had no cover. They employed dummy convoys and diversions to draw submarines away from real shipping. They understood, as German commanders were coming to understand, that this theater was not about the individual merchant ship, but about the strategic implications of letting supplies through to the Soviet Union versus the cost of trying to stop them. Every U-boat committed to the Arctic was a U-boat not available for the Atlantic, where losses were also mounting unsustainably. U-995's Arctic operations would span more than a year, multiple patrols, and a cumulative exposure to conditions that tested every system on the boat and every resource within her crew. The logistics of supporting a submarine fleet in the Arctic were grueling. The Norwegian bases had to be supplied from Germany, across waters increasingly dominated by Allied naval and air power. The U-boats themselves had to be repaired and maintained, in conditions where even basic tasks became epics of will and ingenuity. A U-boat that might need 10 days in dry dock in Germany for routine maintenance required weeks in the Arctic, because every system had to be approached in context of the cold. Welding became a process that demanded extreme care because metal became brittle. Diesel oil had to be heated constantly or it would congeal. The torpedoes that were stacked in the boat's tubes and in the magazine were temperamental weapons even in warm water. In the Arctic, they became even more finicky. Their electric heaters drew power that the boat could not always spare. Their mechanisms moved sluggishly when the temperature dropped, and their gyroscopes were affected by the extreme cold in ways that were not fully understood. The strategic rationale for this deployment, sound as it was in the logic of German naval thinking, did not survive long enough to vindicate itself. The convoys to Murmansk were protected, and the number of merchant ships sunk never approached the tonnage that might justify the commitment of U-boats that were becoming increasingly precious. The British and their allies had learned, through the bitter lessons of previous Arctic convoy operations, what defenses were necessary to make the route sustainable. They deployed battleships when necessary. They concentrated destroyer and minesweeper forces. They created intelligence networks that gave them warning of U-boat movements, information that came in part from the same Enigma decryption that was decimating the U-boat force in the Atlantic, though this fact would remain unknown to U-995's crew until long after the war ended. What the Germans achieved in the Arctic was not a strategic victory, but a strategic holding action, a persistent threat that had to be respected and countered, which tied down British resources and maintained a shadow of the terror that the U-boat arm had once inspired. But the age of the U-boat as a war-winning weapon was over. U-995 was sailing into a theater, not because Germany could win there, but because she had already lost everywhere else. Yet for the men aboard U-995 and the other boats deployed northward, this context remained largely abstract. They knew, at an emotional level, that the war was going against them. They could see it in the increasing number of boats that failed to return, in the aging of their experienced officers, as steady losses forced new commanders into positions of responsibility before they were fully ready, in the quality of the newest crews arriving from training. But the immediate reality was the concrete thing: the Arctic, the convoys, the orders from BDU, the depth charges that periodically shook the boat and reminded them that the British escort forces were in earnest. They understood, with the clarity that comes from direct experience, that the Arctic was not a place of mercy. It was not a theater where men could afford to make mistakes, or where luck compensated for poor judgment. They sailed north because they were ordered to sail north. They hunted because hunting was their function. They survived if they could survive, and if they could not, they became statistics in a ledger in Berlin that was growing longer with each month that passed. The redeployment to the Arctic marked a transition point in U-995's operational career. It was not a moment of triumph or glory. It was a moment of necessity, a response to strategic pressures that could not be denied, and to the simple fact that the Atlantic could no longer absorb the losses the U-boat arm was sustaining. The theaters were shifting. The war was contracting into fewer and narrower spaces where submarines could still function, still threaten enemy shipping, still perform the function that German naval doctrine had given them. The Arctic offered something that the Atlantic no longer did: the promise, however temporary, of waters where the U-boat arm might still matter. That promise would prove fragile and short-lived, but for now, as U-995 slipped northward through the Norwegian fjords toward the ice and the dark and the convoys, it was the only promise that remained: the ice, the cold, the darkness. These were not obstacles to be overcome. They were simply the environment, the new reality, the strange new world that U-995 and her crew would have to inhabit and endure as the larger war that had brought them all to this place continued its inexorable momentum toward an end that none of them could yet see. The Arctic had a way of making men forget what safety felt like. By the time U-995 and her sister boats began their patrols into the frozen north, the war had already taught the German submarine service hard lessons about the cost of underestimating Allied defenses. The waters around the North Cape were not the open Atlantic that earlier U-boat commanders had prowled with relative freedom. These were contested waters, where every convoy that moved toward Murmansk or Arkhangelsk did so under layers of protection that grew thicker and more sophisticated with each passing month. The search for a target became an exercise in patience and risk calculation, hours or days of careful positioning while the boat crept through fog and ice flow, watching for the smoke on the horizon that would signal the presence of merchant vessels worth dying for. The commanding officers of boats like U-995 understood that the mathematics of their situation had shifted. They were not hunting with the advantage anymore. They were calculating survival odds and accepting that most patrols would yield nothing but the grinding wear of diesel engines, the constant vigilance against aircraft, and the knowledge that every other boat dispatched to these waters seemed to disappear. The standard patrol procedure began far from any convoy. U-995 would depart her Norwegian base in the darkness, or the murk of Arctic twilight, her diesel engines thrumming at a steady economic pace that would carry her roughly 50 kilometers away from the fjord before she slowed and began her hunt. The boat's radio watch would maintain contact with shore-based U-boat headquarters, receiving daily summary reports of where convoy activity had been detected in the previous 24 hours. These reports came from multiple sources: sightings reported by other U-boats, radio direction finding intercepts that triangulated convoy positions from their radio traffic, and the assessments of the shore-based operations staff who tried to vector boats toward contact. For the commanding officer, this was a balance between obedience to strategic direction and the autonomous judgment required to handle a boat in waters where any radio transmission became a beacon to the hunter as much as a lifeline to command. Some captains maintained frequent radio contact. Others went silent for weeks, knowing that the apparatus of detection was always listening. The tension between centralized command and tactical autonomy was never fully resolved, and each man had to navigate it according to his own temperament and understanding of the odds. When a convoy was located, the initial approach unfolded with deliberate care. The boat would attempt to place herself ahead of the merchant ship's estimated course and wait, remaining submerged or running on the surface, depending on visibility and the location of known escort vessels. This was where the Arctic itself became an ally or an enemy. In the months of perpetual or near-perpetual daylight, the summer patrols were exercises in extreme caution, with the boat running deep and slow, conserving battery power, listening through her hydrophones for the sound signatures of escort vessels. The hydrophone operators, young men trained to interpret the subtle acoustic signatures of different ships, could sometimes determine the composition of an escort by sound alone, the characteristic rhythm of different types of naval engines, the frequency of propeller noise, the particular acoustic character of a corvette versus a minesweeper versus a trawler armed with depth charge throwers. In the winter darkness, when the perpetual night returned, the boat could often surface and approach at speed on the diesel engines, a faster and more direct tactic, but one that carried the constant risk of stumbling into the escort screen before warning came. The commanding officer's decision about how to approach, whether to be patient or aggressive, whether to trust in darkness or in stealth, whether to accept the risk of moving fast versus the attrition of moving slowly, carried weight that he alone bore. The convoy itself, when finally engaged, presented a tactical problem that had become progressively more difficult. Early in the war, a U-boat could position herself among merchant ships and fire multiple torpedoes at short range, confident that the escorts would be relatively few and relatively lightly armed. By 1943 and beyond, the merchant vessels were clustered more tightly, protected by increasing numbers of escort vessels stationed in defensive patterns around them, with some ships carrying their own defensive armament, and all of them maneuvering on a signal from the convoy commodore. The approach had to be calculated to place U-95 in a firing position with sufficient distance from the escorts, ideally more than 4 kilometers away, where the escort vessel's depth charge attacks would be less immediately devastating, while still close enough that the torpedoes, with their relatively modest speed and fuel endurance, could reach the target. A U-boat firing at extreme range would burn precious fuel to run toward the targets, and a boat that ran out of diesel or battery power in the presence of a hostile escort had already accepted her fate. The commanding officer thus faced a calculus of competing risks: fire from distance and risk missing the target, move closer for a more reliable shot and risk being detected and rammed or sunk before the torpedoes could be launched. The decision had no correct answer, only the decision that a particular man made on a particular day, with imperfect information and the knowledge that his choice would determine whether his crew returned, or whether some of them, or all of them, would not. When the firing run began, the boat would typically dive to a shallow depth of 6 to 10 meters if the escort pattern permitted, allowing the captain to use the periscope to aim the attack. The sound of the torpedo running out would register through the boat's hull, and then the crew would hear nothing but their own breathing and the acoustic system as they turned the boat to clear their stern tubes for a second or third shot if the firing sequence allowed. The merchant ship, if struck, would shudder and groan, the underwater shockwave carrying through the water and registering even inside the submarine's pressure hull. Some ships went down in minutes, their hulls broken and their crews scrambling for lifeboats in freezing water. Others, hit but not mortally, would begin to burn or list and settle slowly, presenting a target so obvious that additional torpedoes would seem wasteful. Then the escorts would come. This was the moment that determined survival. If the boat was detected immediately, the depth charge attack would begin while she was still at shallow depth, before she could maneuver or hide. The escorts knew the waters and could estimate the probable position of a submarine that had just fired. The older British trawlers that served as convoy escorts carried ahead, throwing depth charge weapons, like the Hedgehog, which could rain explosive charges across a wider area than the traditional depth charges fired from the stern. Norwegian minesweepers, serving with the British, were particularly aggressive. The boat would feel the explosions more acutely at shallower depth, the pressure waves flexing the hull, and the commanding officer would order the boat deeper, using every meter of water depth as a shield against further attacks. The structural and psychological consequences of a depth charge attack were severe and cumulative. The Type VIIC hull was designed to withstand pressure to a depth of around 230 meters, though most commanding officers knew that boats had been lost at much shallower depths when the attack was sustained, and the damage was severe. A depth charge detonating within roughly 30 meters of the boat would create a pressure wave that could spring the seams of riveted plating, open the access hatches between compartments, or shatter the delicate gauges and instruments that the crew depended on to navigate. The boat would assume an uncontrolled angle, her bow tilting up or down, and the crew would scramble to restore trim using water ballast. The air inside grew thick with the smell of diesel and electrical fire and human sweat. Lights would fail, leaving the boat in darkness except for emergency lamps, and the crew would work by feel and years of training to restore propulsion or stop a flooding compartment. A second or third attack, if the escorts stayed above the boat and continued to hunt, would come within minutes, before the crew had fully recovered from the previous assault. The silence after the explosions stopped was often worse than the noise. The boat would hang in the water, engines off, crew motionless, listening for the sound of the escort's engines. Sometimes the escorts would give up and return to the convoy. Sometimes, after minutes or hours of this careful silence, the explosions would begin again, and the boat would have to run deeper or in another direction, increasingly uncertain of her position, increasingly aware that the batteries were being depleted by the effort to remain silent and avoid further detection. Many of U-995's Arctic patrols followed this pattern: the search, the stealthy approach, the brief violence of the torpedo attack, and the desperate evasion of the counterattack. Some patrols returned to base with confirmed sinkings, the boat's success marked in the records, and the commanding officer able to report concrete results for the danger his crew had undergone. Other patrols returned with nothing. The convoy had not been located, or had been located but the escort screen was too strong to penetrate, or the attack had been attempted but had failed because the torpedo had malfunctioned, or the targeting had been inaccurate. The commanding officer who returned with no sinkings faced a different psychological burden than the one who returned with kills. Even though both had exposed their crews to identical danger, the shore-based commanders judged success by tonnage sunk and convoys disrupted. The crew judged it by survival. These two measures of success were often at odds. The patrols that returned with the heaviest toll of sinkings often came at the cost of damage to the boat, or losses of crew killed in action, or from the effects of depth charging. The boat that surfaced at the end of a patrol intact, and with all crew alive, but with no sinkings to report, had in some sense accomplished its own priority, preservation of itself, even as it had failed the larger strategic mission for which it had been dispatched. The Arctic winter brought different challenges. In the months of continuous or near-continuous darkness, U-995 could transit the surface at high speed, using her diesel engines to cover greater distances and search wider areas. But the continuous darkness meant that visual detection of convoys became harder, and the boat became more dependent on radio direction-finding intelligence from shore-based operators who triangulated the position of convoy radio transmissions. The sea itself became more hostile. The waves grew larger, the wind more severe, and the boat became vulnerable in a different way. A U-boat on the surface in heavy seas was a slow and unstable gun platform, and the conning tower structure that allowed the crew to fight the boat from above the pressure hull became a liability in the mountainous waves of the Arctic winter. The commanding officer had to judge whether the speed advantage of surface running was worth the increased chance of being seen and engaged. Several boats were lost in these waters after being detected on the surface and rammed or engaged by escort vessels at ranges too close to permit escape. The decisions about when to dive, when to surface, when to use high-speed tactics, and when to use stealth accumulated over the course of a patrol. A commanding officer who made the right choice consistently might bring his boat through dozens of patrols. One who made the wrong choice once might not bring his boat through any. The human consequences of these decisions were recorded in the crew's experience, though often not in the official logs. Men who survived multiple Arctic patrols reported that the grinding tension of the hunt and the fear of the counterattack created a psychological wear that was almost as dangerous as the physical threat. The crew lived in constant expectation of attack. The hydrophone operator, listening to the water through passive acoustic sensors, would report every sound, a distant explosion, a ship's engines, anything that might signal the approach of a convoy or the deployment of an escort. The commanding officer and his first watch officer would debate the interpretation, discuss whether to move toward the contact or away from it, whether the sound profile suggested a merchant ship or a warship. Young men would make judgments about acoustic signatures that they had practiced only in training, knowing that a mistake might place the boat in the path of a ramming attack or in the kill zone of a depth charge pattern. The boat rolled and pitched in the heavy Arctic seas, and the crew worked to maintain the machinery while suspended in perpetual motion and perpetual awareness. Sleep, when it came, was broken and shallow, interrupted by alarm bells or the sudden need to respond to a developing contact. The enlisted crew depended absolutely on their commanding officer's judgment, a reliance that created bonds of intense loyalty, but also a vulnerability that could not be protected against. If the captain made a mistake, if he misjudged the escort pattern, or failed to detect an approaching ship before it was too close, the crew would die together, drowning in the dark water, or suffocating in a damaged compartment, and there would be nothing they could have done to prevent it. The tactical encounters between U-995 and the Allied escort vessels were often brief and decisive, though the official records preserved only fragments of what actually occurred. The escorts were usually British or Norwegian destroyers, corvettes, or converted trawlers, their crews equally experienced and equally desperate to prevent the loss of the convoy and the merchant crews they were protecting. When a U-boat was detected, the standard procedure was for the escort to move toward the suspected position of the boat and drop patterns of depth charges, attempting to bracket the submarine with explosions that would damage the hull or render it immobile. The U-boat would attempt to evade through maneuver, either running deeper or attempting to move aside at high speed on battery power. At close range, the boat had relatively few advantages. The escort was faster on the surface and could attack without warning. Underwater, the boat was slower than the escort's depth charges, and the best that could be hoped for was that the boat would position itself outside the expected kill zone, or that the escort's depth estimations would be inaccurate. Some boat captains developed a reputation for aggressive counterattack, surfacing after a depth charge attack and attempting to engage the escort with deck guns, or even ramming if the opportunity presented itself. Others believed in stealth and evasion, trusting that the escape would be more reliable than the fight. U-995's successive commanding officers made these choices according to their own judgment and experience, and the boat and crew lived or died on the basis of those choices. The geography of the Arctic patrols created additional tactical complications. The bases in Norwegian fjords were secure, hidden beneath concrete bunkers and surrounded by flak defenses against air attack. But the patrol areas around the North Cape and the approaches to the Murmansk route were constrained waters where shallow depths and narrow channels limited maneuver. A boat that was detected in these waters had fewer options for escape than in the open ocean. She could not run indefinitely. The distances were too small, and the escort vessels too fast. She could not hide effectively. The fjords and passages were heavily patrolled, and the water too shallow for effective concealment. The boat had to either fight through to open water or accept that she had been cornered. Some commanding officers accepted the fate as it came. Others fought with extraordinary determination to get clear of the patrol area and return to base. The loss rates in the Arctic were severe. Close your eyes and imagine being pressed into an iron box with 44 other men for weeks at a time. Not metaphorically, literally. A steel pressure hull measuring 91 meters in length, but only 6 meters in maximum diameter. A cylinder built to withstand the crushing weight of the Atlantic at depth, which meant there was barely any room to move sideways once you stepped inside. The Type VIIC submarine was a feat of engineering, yes, but it was also something else entirely. A coffin that had to function as an office, a bedroom, a galley, a workshop, and a weapon system all at once. U-995 was no exception. She carried 56 men when fully crewed, though operational patrols sometimes meant 30 or 40 souls depending on losses and replacements. Every single one of them was living inside a machine that groaned under pressure, that smelled of diesel fuel and human sweat and decay, and that could kill them all in minutes if the wrong valve opened at the wrong depth. The interior of a submarine like this was not a place designed for human comfort. It was not even designed for human survival, precisely. It was designed to accomplish a mission. Comfort was irrelevant. Survival was merely incidental. The smell hits you first when you step through the hatch. Diesel oil, yes, but underneath that, something else. A thick, organic reek that accumulated and never quite dissipated, no matter how well the ventilation system worked. The boat's battery compartments located beneath the crew's bunk spaces, leaked hydrogen gas constantly. Sweat accumulated on every metal surface. The galley produced cooking smells that would permeate every cubic meter of air and cling to skin and uniforms for weeks. Add to that the open buckets used for human waste in the aft compartment. There was no real toilet in the early warboats, and even the later modifications were barely functional when submerged for extended periods. And you begin to approach the reality of what the nose experienced during a 4-week patrol. Submariners developed a gallows humor about it. Older crew members could allegedly identify a boat by smell alone in the dark. Young sailors new to the service would spend their first few days fighting nausea that had nothing to do with seasickness, and everything to do with the fact that they were breathing the same recycled air as 44 other men, and that air had nowhere to go. The smell became normal after a week. That normalization was itself psychologically significant. It meant your brain had surrendered some essential part of its ability to reject the environment. You were no longer a separate consciousness visiting an unnatural space. You had become part of the machine. The heat came next. Not comfort heat, oppressive, radiating heat from the diesel engines and electric motors, and the bodies of 44 men crowded into a space designed for perhaps 30. In tropical waters, internal temperatures could exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Even in the North Atlantic, with seawater at 4 or 5 degrees Celsius surrounding the hull, the heat below decks could become unbearable. The diesel engines generated tremendous warmth, and there was no practical way to dissipate it without running expensive ventilation that created noise the boat could not afford. So men sweated. They sweated continuously. Their uniforms became soaked within hours of leaving port. The traditional solution was to strip to the waist or wear minimal clothing in the engine rooms, but even that provided minimal relief. Dehydration was chronic. The fresh water supply was carefully rationed because it had to be used for boiler feed and cooling systems first. Human consumption second. Men drank thin, chicory-based coffee and ate hard biscuits and canned preserves, and their bodies gradually adapted to a state of perpetual slight thirst that they learned to live with, the way they learned to live with the smell and the noise. The body's adaptation to these conditions was remarkable and terrible. Sweat glands became less responsive. The sensation of thirst diminished. Men became pale, as if the constant artificial light and the weeks without natural daylight were leaching color from skin and hair. Old submarine photographs show crews on the deck of their boat at the moment of return, looking gaunt and discolored, as if they had been preserved in brine. The noise was almost as significant as the smell and the heat, though harder to describe to someone who had never experienced it. A diesel engine running full throttle in the central engine room made continuous loud mechanical noise, the thunder of pistons, the hum of the electric generators, the hiss of air entering carburetors, the gurgle of seawater cooling the condenser, the rattle of loose fittings vibrating against their mounts. When the engines shut down and the boat went to silent running on electric batteries to avoid detection, there was a different kind of noise. The hum of the electric motors themselves, high-pitched and piercing, combined with the creaks and groans of the pressure hull responding to depth changes, the occasional snap of metal expanding or contracting. Talking required raising your voice. Sleeping meant learning to sleep through constant noise that varied in pitch and intensity. The sound of compressed air flowing into the ballast tanks had a particular note that experienced submariners could identify instantly, a sound that meant the boat was beginning to dive or surface. Every sound carried information. Every sound could also carry danger. A mechanical rattle that had previously gone unnoticed might indicate a developing failure. The acoustic environment was so saturated with noise that the silence that occasionally fell during a moment of maintenance or a brief passage through calm water felt unnatural and almost frightening, as if the absence of noise indicated that something had stopped working. Crews learned to read their boats through sound, the way someone might read another person's mood through tone of voice. Sleep became one of the most precious and most contentious resources aboard U-995. There were not enough bunks for 56 men. The standard solution was hot bunking, 2 or 3 sailors rotating through a single bunk, using it in shifts. A sailor would climb out as his shift ended, leaving behind body-warmed sheets for the next man to use immediately. This system worked, in the abstract, but it broke down in practice whenever the boat needed to conduct operations or endure stress. A depth charge attack might mean that no one was sleeping properly for 8 or 10 hours. A convoy approach could last an entire night, with crews at or near combat stations, moving through the boat in high states of alertness. Young sailors would go without real sleep for days, and then crash into complete unconsciousness for hours at a time, only to be awakened by the alarm bells and forced instantly back into a state of focused attention. Sleep deprivation accumulated. After 2 weeks at sea, the psychological effects became visible. Irritability, slower thinking, minor mistakes in routine procedures. After 3 weeks, men began to develop a kind of 1,000-yard stare. After 4 weeks, some submariners would later report that they barely remembered the patrol at all, as if they had been operating on pure automatic neural response. The medical records that survive suggest that some boat captains would actually order men off their watch duties and into bunks midway through a patrol, simply to prevent breakdown. Sleep, in this context, was not a luxury. It was a necessity that had to be fought for and stolen when possible. The diet was another source of both stability and psychological strain. The galley aboard a Type submarine was barely large enough for one person to work in at a time. The cook was an essential person aboard. His morale and his competence had outsized influence on crew morale. He worked in a space barely 3 meters long and less than 2 meters wide, standing in front of a small electric stove or occasionally a temporary paraffin burner, trying to produce something resembling actual food for men who were burning enormous amounts of calories under stress and in the cold. When the boat first departed, there was fresh food: bread, butter, eggs, fresh meat. This lasted perhaps 4 to 7 days. After that, the diet was hardtack: canned meat, canned vegetables, preserved in salt, hard sausage, dried potatoes, and occasionally canned fish. The bread disappeared and was replaced by biscuits that could last for months. Water was carefully rationed. The result was a monotonous, nutritionally adequate, but deeply unsatisfying diet that began to wear on morale after 3 or 4 weeks. Some boats apparently developed a tradition of celebrating their midway point at the 2-week mark of a 4-week patrol with a special meal, a moment of psychological reprieve in which the cook would somehow produce something approaching flavor from his minimal resources. The caloric intake was actually probably insufficient given the stress and the work rate, but no one was consciously aware of that. What they knew was that they were always slightly hungry, always slightly unsatisfied, and that this small deprivation added to all the other deprivations they were living with. The physical injuries and illnesses that accumulated during long patrols were another hidden cost of submarine service. The constant cold, the damp, the recycled air, all of these created conditions favorable to respiratory infections. Men would develop hacking coughs that would echo through the boat and mark them as sick even before any officer noticed. Infections of the skin were common, particularly fungal infections, encouraged by the constant sweat and the inability to change clothes frequently. Cuts and minor wounds would become infected more easily because the air and surfaces of the boat were not clean in any meaningful sense. The dark, the vibration, the constant alert posture would cause headaches that some men experienced as genuine migraines. Minor injuries from banging your head on a pipe or catching your hand on a sharp edge would happen regularly in a space where you had to move sideways through narrow compartments, ducking under pipes and stepping over cables constantly. There was a medical officer aboard, a junior officer with basic training in first aid and the contents of a small medical kit. But the reality of medical care at sea was limited to bandaging, the occasional antibacterial powder, and advice to rest when rest was impossible. More serious incidents, a truly severe infection, a major injury, something approaching an internal emergency, would require the boat to surface and signal for help or to alter course to reach a port. Neither option was desirable, and both were often impossible. The boats that are well documented suggest that some medical situations were simply endured until they could be treated ashore, weeks later, after whatever systemic damage had accumulated. The social structure aboard a Type submarine was stratified and rigid, yet also bound by an interdependence so intense that normal military hierarchy sometimes had to yield to practical necessity. At the top was the commanding officer, usually a junior officer with the rank of Kapitänleutnant, a captain equivalent rank. He was responsible for every decision, every risk, every outcome of the patrol. He had read the war orders from the high command. He knew the strategic situation. He also knew, by mid-1944, that statistically, his boat had a limited lifespan, that the average U-boat that went out to sea would not come home. Some historians would later calculate, based on lost data, that a U-boat had perhaps a 40 to 50% chance of returning from a patrol, and those odds got steadily worse as the war progressed. The commanding officer lived with that knowledge consciously. He read the reports from other boats. He knew who had not returned. Every radio message from other boats that was intercepted, every failure that was reported, every loss that was acknowledged. He was accumulating knowledge of a catastrophe unfolding in real time. Below the commanding officer was the first officer watch, usually a young officer, perhaps in his mid-20s, who served as executive officer and navigator. Below that was the chief engineer, responsible for the machinery. Below that were senior non-commissioned officers, the petty officers who ran the machinery compartments, who knew every system by touch and sound, who were the institutional memory of the boat. Below that was the mass of younger sailors, many of them conscripted, all of them subordinate. Yet the interdependence aboard was so extreme that this hierarchy had to be leavened with something approaching camaraderie. A crew member who was assigned to the forward torpedo room had to trust the petty officer in the engine room to keep the electrical supply flowing. The men in the diesel room had to trust the engineers aft to keep the batteries charged properly. Everyone had to trust the lookouts on the conning tower to see an aircraft in time, and everyone had to trust whoever was at the depth gauge to call out corrections so the boat maintained her neutral buoyancy. You could not maintain military discipline in the traditional sense in an environment where your life was literally dependent on the technical competence and moment-to-moment attention of men you could reach out and touch from your bunk. The result was a submarine culture that was distinct from surface naval culture, more informal in some ways, more rigidly functional in others. Officers and men ate the same food, worked in the same air, endured the same conditions. The class lines did not disappear, but they became permeable. A new ensign who made a mistake would be corrected firmly, but without the humiliation that might have been visited on him in a surface warship. Experienced petty officers would sometimes advise officers on tactical matters, and the advice would be accepted because their experience was genuine and their judgment had been proven reliable. The boat itself became almost a third entity in this structure. Not quite person, not quite machine, but something that demanded attention and response, and that seemed to have moods and preferences of its own. The commanding officer's burden was particular and acute. He had several hundred crew members in his flotilla back at the base, and he would receive intelligence reports about where the convoys were moving, what Allied escorts were operating in which areas, and where other U-boats had been lost. He would make decisions about where to patrol, how to approach targets, whether to attack or to withdraw. Those decisions, if wrong, would kill the people under his command. If he was too cautious, he would be reassigned or criticized by the high command. If he was too aggressive, his boat would be sunk. The statistical reality was that most of the boats he knew would not make it through the war. Some commanding officers would go out on patrol after patrol and keep a mental list of fellow captains they would never see again. They would learn of losses through messages received while on patrol, or through reports that would arrive after they returned to base. The psychological weight of that accumulated knowledge is difficult to overstate. Memoirs and interviews with surviving U-boat captains, conducted decades after the war, often mention a specific moment, perhaps in 1943 or 1944, when they began to understand that the war was being lost, and that the loss would involve the deaths of men they commanded. Some responded by pressing their patrols with greater aggression, trying to achieve enough of whatever small tactical success was possible to justify the risk being taken. Others became more cautious, trying to maximize the chances that their boat would return. Others seemed simply to accept what was coming, to do their duty, and to live with the knowledge that the outcome was beyond their control. The life of a U-boat was never truly autonomous. From the moment U-995 left her pen and slipped beneath the surface of the Norwegian fjord, she remained tethered to shore by invisible wires of radio transmission and encrypted command. That tether was Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, BDU, the commander-in-chief of the U-boat fleet and the staff headquarters that orchestrated the movements of Germany's underwater war across the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, where a surface warship captain might operate with considerable independence, making tactical decisions across weeks of cruising with no contact from home. A U-boat commander was never truly alone. The waters around him were haunted by the constant awareness that men ashore in Hamburg or Berlin or the Norwegian bases were reading his position, shaping his mission, calling him forward into areas where they believed prey was waiting. To understand how U-995 fought, you must understand this relationship between boat and command, and to understand that relationship is to grasp one of the war's most consequential and tragic asymmetries. The Enigma machine, the electromechanical cipher device that sat humming in the radio rooms of German warships and U-boats, was the nervous system through which this control flowed. The machine looked deceptively simple. A typewriter keyboard connected to an array of rotating drums called rotors, each one wired to scramble the electrical path between a letter pressed on the keyboard and a letter that would light up on a display panel above. The scrambling happened through a bewildering combination of rotor positions, plug-board connections, and reflector arrangements, and the mathematics behind it was sophisticated enough that when an Enigma operator typed the letter A, it might emerge as the letter T, and if he typed A again, a moment later, it would become a different letter entirely. The genius of Enigma was that it was reciprocal. If the receiving operator had his machine set to exactly the same configuration, he could type out the encrypted message and recover the original text. The nightmare was that the configuration had to be changed daily across the entire German armed forces, and the sequence of changes was distributed in codebooks that supposedly only authorized operators possessed. Every day at midnight, The thousands of Enigma machines in German service, on U-boats, on destroyers, in army headquarters, in the Gestapo and the SS, would reset to a new configuration. Only those with the codebook would know what that configuration was. U-995 carried an Enigma machine in her radio compartment, and her radio operators, skilled technicians who lived in the cramped space where the most sophisticated communications equipment the German Navy possessed was squeezed into the boat's narrow hull, maintained the same daily codebooks as every other U-boat. The machine was their tool for both receiving orders and transmitting reports back to BDU. A typical command message from shore might instruct U-995 to proceed to a specific grid square in the North Atlantic, or to join a coordinated pack attack on a convoy, or to break off a patrol due to weather or fuel consumption estimates. The reports sent back to BDU carried operational intelligence, the position and composition of enemy convoys sighted, the results of attacks, mechanical damage sustained, fuel and provision status, and crew morale. These encrypted messages passed through the ether night and day, creating a vast web of intelligence flowing in both directions, and it was a web that appeared to the Germans to be absolutely secure. The Enigma machine had been used in the previous war and had proven resilient then. Military theorists and cryptographers across Germany were confident that the mathematics were unbreakable, that no enemy could possibly discover the daily settings, and therefore no enemy could possibly read their traffic. But in a converted Victorian mansion in the English countryside called Bletchley Park, several thousand mathematicians, linguists, logicians, and eccentric geniuses had already broken into that system and were reading it almost daily. The story of Enigma codebreaking is so well documented now that it risks becoming abstract, but the reality for U-995's crew, and for thousands of other German commanders, was devastatingly concrete. Through a combination of captured Enigma rotors, mathematical ingenuity, mechanical computing devices that represented the cutting edge of pre-digital engineering, and a structure of work that processed millions of encrypted messages and distributed the decrypted intelligence to British naval authorities within hours, the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park and the naval intelligence specialists at the submarine tracking room in London had cracked the U-boat Enigma variant. They could read the orders flowing from BDU to individual U-boats. They could read the patrol reports coming back. They knew where U-boats were being sent, what their objectives were, when they were supposed to rendezvous with supply submarines or other boats in a coordinated pack. This intelligence advantage, often called ultra, was so valuable and so secret that fewer than 100 people in the entire British government and military knew of its existence. The effect on the Atlantic campaign was massive, though it unfolded gradually and was never perfect. In the spring of 1943, when the U-boat campaign was entering what German submariners called the Krise, the crisis period, the improvements in convoy routing, the sudden appearance of escort forces exactly where U-boats were supposed to congregate, the coordinated air and surface attacks that seemed to anticipate U-boat movements, all of this appeared to German submarine crews and commanders as a sudden flowering of Allied effectiveness. They attributed it to improved radar, to new escort tactics, to stronger convoy defenses, to more aircraft. None of them knew that their own plans were being read before they were executed. A U-boat would receive orders from BDU to proceed to a particular grid square and join other boats in a pack attack on a convoy reported to be transiting that area. The encrypted order would be enciphered on Enigma and broadcast to the boat, but within hours of that same order being encrypted and sent, the British would be reading it at Bletchley Park and relaying decrypted information to the convoy routing authorities. The convoy would alter course away from the ambush site. The U-boat would arrive at the designated grid square to find nothing but empty ocean. The attack that BDU had planned, the pack coordination that had been encrypted and transmitted with such operational confidence, would dissolve into frustration and failure. Crucially, this intelligence advantage did not remain constant throughout the war. There were periods when the Germans changed their procedures, introduced new rotor combinations, or altered their security protocols, and the Enigma codebreakers would lose access for weeks or even months. In February 1943, just as U-995 was beginning her working up in the Baltic, the Germans introduced a new rotor, Rotor number 5, to the U-boat Enigma. For 10 months, the Bletchley Park codebreakers were locked out. They could not read U-boat traffic. Convoy routing authorities had to rely on direction-finding intelligence and visual sightings to avoid U-boat patrol lines, and during this period, the U-boat campaign briefly recovered. But in December 1943, the codebreakers broke back in, and from that point forward, until the end of the war, they had a consistent window into U-boat operations. U-995, by that time, was already conducting her operational patrols in the Arctic and North Atlantic. Everything she and her commanding officers did was in principle readable by the British. Every tactical decision was made in the shadow of an intelligence advantage that U-995's commanders would never know existed. This is perhaps the most profound asymmetry that shaped U-995's operational career and those of thousands of her sister boats. It was not visible to the crew. There were no enemy agents aboard, no traitors sending information, no captured intelligence documents compromising their operations. The U-boat crews experienced their failures as bad luck, as the consequence of improved enemy defenses, as the outcome of bad weather, or mechanical problems, or simple tactical mistakes. When U-995 was spotted by patrol aircraft and forced to dive, it appeared to be the result of enemy vigilance. The crew did not know that the aircraft had been sent to her location, because the aircraft's controller had read U-995's position report in an intercepted radio transmission. When a convoy altered course, away from a waiting U-boat pack, it appeared to be coincidental. The crews did not know that the convoy had been deliberately routed around an ambush that BDU had ordered, and which Bletchley Park had decrypted and warned about. When attacks failed and U-boats were sunk by forces that seemed to appear exactly where they were supposed to be, these appeared as isolated tragedies, as the fortunes of war, as the cost of submarine operations against an increasingly formidable enemy. The command structure that issued orders to U-995 operated through a hierarchical system centered on BDU headquarters, which moved several times during the war, but was primarily located in France before the invasion, and then in Germany as the Third Reich contracted. The Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote was a flag officer, a rear admiral, who maintained a staff of operations officers, intelligence specialists, and communications personnel who maintained continuous situational awareness of where every active U-boat was believed to be, what its fuel and ammunition status was, where it had reported sighting enemy shipping, and what the strategic priorities were at any given moment. These officers studied patrol reports from returning boats, analyzed the results of pack operations, received intelligence about enemy convoy movements and anti-submarine tactics from the Kriegsmarine's own reconnaissance assets, and from the naval attachment in Japan, sending reports from the Far East. They synthesized all of this into a comprehensive picture of the Atlantic and Arctic campaigns, and used that picture to issue orders that would direct hundreds of U-boats toward maximum destructive effect. It was, in its way, an impressive feat of command and intelligence coordination. The problem was that the foundation on which it rested, the security of the Enigma communications system, had been compromised without their knowledge. The practical effect for U-995 was that she would receive orders to patrol specific grid squares, to maintain watch for convoys in particular areas, to rendezvous with supply submarines or other boats, to attack specific targets that BDU believed to be in transit through certain waters. The orders came as encrypted Enigma messages that her radio operators would decrypt using the daily rotors and the codebooks they carried. The captain would receive these orders in their plain text form and would incorporate them into his tactical plans. He might report back to BDU when he had reached his assigned area, when he sighted enemy shipping, when he was attacking, when he had completed his mission. These reports were also encrypted with Enigma before transmission, adding to the stream of traffic that the Bletchley Park codebreakers were decrypting in near real time. The British naval intelligence specialists who received these decrypted messages at the submarine tracking room in the Admiralty would plot U-995's position on their charts, track her movements, estimate her fuel and supply status, and pass this information to the convoy routing authorities and to the escort commanders protecting Allied shipping in the Atlantic. This invisible knowledge shaped everything. When U-95 was ordered to a particular grid square and arrived to find the ocean empty, it was because the convoy had already been warned away. When she reported a sighting of an enemy force and asked for permission to engage, and discovered that the force had already altered course or increased speed, it was because BDU's response, which she expected to be secure, had already been read by her enemy. When coordinated pack attacks that BDU had carefully arranged through encrypted orders dissolved into chaos and failure, it was not because the German officers at BDU were incompetent or because the subordinate commanders were poorly trained, but because the British had read the operational plan in advance. The tragic irony is that many of U-995's commanders, many of the flag officers who staffed BDU, many of the radio operators and the crew members who believed in the security of their communications, went through the entire war without ever learning the truth. They never knew that the intelligence advantage they had assumed was working against them was actually working for their enemy. That knowledge came only after the war ended, when the Germans had surrendered and the British chose, slowly, to reveal what they had been doing. For U-995 and her crew, the operational consequence was a steady accumulation of frustration and loss. Patrols that should have been successful, according to the intelligence picture that BDU was working with, ended in failure. Boats that were sent to intercept convoys arrived to find empty ocean. Packs that had been coordinated through encrypted messages that the Germans believed were absolutely secure were dispersed and disrupted by enemy forces that seemed to know exactly where they were. And all the while, the crew aboard U-995, young men living in the grinding monotony and terror of submarine warfare, breathing recycled air that grew fouler with each passing day, maintaining their watch schedules and their torpedo readiness and their faith in their commanders, had no idea that a machine in an English country house was reading every encrypted message they transmitted and received. They lived with the consequences of this intelligence disadvantage without knowing that it existed, which is perhaps the deepest tragedy of all. They believed they were fighting a fair fight, or as fair a fight as submarine warfare could ever be, when in reality, they were operating blind while the enemy could see them perfectly. This was the long arm of BDU, reaching across the oceans to direct U-995's movements. But it was a reach that extended not just to the boat and her crew, but to the rooms where British intelligence officers read the encrypted orders before the boats themselves had time to execute them. The radio waves carried the commands, but they also carried, unbeknownst to anyone aboard U-995, the shape of everything that would follow. The war beneath the waves was not fought with steel alone. It was fought with sensors and signals, with mathematics and materials science, with the desperate improvisation of engineers racing against time, and the systematic innovation of rivals who refused to be outpaced. U-995 was not simply a submarine. She was a floating laboratory of this invisible conflict. Her hull and systems modified so many times during her operational life that the boat that returned to port bore only a passing resemblance to the vessel that had first slid into the Elbe. To understand what U-995 became and why her survival mattered is to follow the technology race that consumed her operators and her hunters from the moment she was commissioned until the war's end. When U-995 entered service in the autumn of 1943, the strategic balance beneath the Atlantic had already begun to shift in ways that were not yet fully apparent to the German naval command. The Allies possessed advantages that no amount of German ingenuity could entirely overcome, but they were not invulnerable, and the race to maintain parity or achieve advantage drove both sides into cycles of innovation that compressed years of development into months. For the U-boats, the central problem was visibility, not their own visibility to enemy eyes, but the enemy's invisibility to them. A convoy could be encountered in darkness or fog by radar long before lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. A U-boat commander operating on the surface could suddenly find himself pinned by airdropped depth charges from an aircraft he had never seen. The boat needed to see farther, sense danger earlier, and disappear faster. The answer came in the form of radar search receivers, devices that could detect the electromagnetic radiation beamed out by Allied search radars and warn a U-boat commander that invisible eyes were scanning the darkness. The Metox receiver, named after its manufacturer, was among the first such devices installed on German submarines in 1942. It was a crude thing, an array of dipoles mounted on a wooden frame that the crew called a Biscay cross because of its shape, but it worked. When an Allied radar beam swept across it, the receiver sent an electrical pulse to a speaker in the control room, and the watch officer knew that detection was imminent. The advantage was enormous and temporary. The Allies learned that the U-boats had radar warning devices and changed their search radar frequencies. The Germans detected the new frequencies and upgraded their receivers. The cycle continued throughout the war. Each innovation met within weeks by counter-innovation, a race that consumed resources and technical talent on both sides, and ultimately favored the side with greater industrial capacity. U-995 carried one of these radar search receivers, installed during her construction or shortly after commissioning, a modification that was invisible from the outside, but which occupied precious space inside an already suffocatingly cramped boat. The crew learned to listen for the characteristic chirp and warble of the speaker, a sound as familiar and as dreaded as the pulse of a sonar ping. They understood that the receiver worked at the speed of light, but that they, in their 3,000-ton steel tube, could operate at perhaps 12 knots on the surface. The mathematics were not in their favor. Detection, once achieved, was nearly inevitable. Speed and darkness were their only defenses. Dive. Get the boat under the surface. In the depths, radar could not follow. But diving took time, precious seconds during which an aircraft, already releasing depth charges, would have already committed to the attack. The other major technological modification that U-995 underwent was the installation of the snorkel mast that represented a fundamental shift in how submarines had to be operated. For decades, submarines had surfaced to run their diesel engines, both to recharge batteries and to move at economic cruising speed. Submerged, they had to rely on electric motors powered by storage batteries, a tactic that was fast but limited in endurance. The snorkel changed the equation by allowing a diesel engine to draw air from the surface while the boat remained beneath it, theoretically in a state of quiet running, where only a small mast was visible above water, rather than the bulk of a hull. The schnorkel was not German in origin. The Dutch had developed it years earlier, but the German Navy adopted it with increasing desperation as the war progressed. For U-995, the installation meant routing and installing new piping, modifying the bridge structure and creating new vulnerabilities. The schnorkel mast itself could be damaged or broken by rough seas. The air intake and exhaust vents created acoustic signatures that modern sonar could detect. It was not a solution. It was a compromise that extended operational capability at the cost of new risks. By 1944, U-995's hull bore the scars and adaptations of this unending technological struggle. Holes had been cut into her superstructure to mount new antenna arrays. Interior spaces had been gutted and reconfigured to accommodate search receivers and their associated electrical systems. The schnorkel mast had been added, changing the visual silhouette that crews recognized as unmistakably German. The original torpedo tubes had been supplemented or modified to accommodate new torpedo types. Each modification reduced internal space further, increased weight, changed the boat's ballast and trim characteristics, and demanded crew retraining. The submarine that left port on a patrol was not identical to the submarine that had returned 6 weeks earlier. The submarine that left port had been remade by the demands of a war that evolved faster than any single platform could follow. While the U-boats were being modified, the Allies were advancing their own systems with comparable intensity. They developed sonar, equipment that sent acoustic pulses through the water and listened for echoes returning from submerged objects. The earliest forms were crude. A trained operator, listening to a hydrophone, could detect the noise of U-boat diesel engines at surprising distances. But as the war progressed, the systems became more sophisticated. Active sonar, which sent out organized pulse patterns and relied on returning echoes, was far more precise, but also gave away the position of the escort vessel using it. Passive sonar, which only listened, revealed position less obviously, but required the operator to interpret the complex acoustic signature of a submarine engine and estimate range from loudness alone. The Allies installed these systems on destroyers, corvettes, and frigates. Nimble, fast vessels, designed to hunt in coordination with the merchant ships they protected. They also began installing sonar buoys, dropped from aircraft, creating zones where a submerged U-boat could not operate undetected. The Allies deployed other innovations that U-boat commanders learned to fear. The Hedgehog was a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar mounted on escort vessels, a weapon that fired a pattern of contact-fused projectiles ahead of a ship, allowing the escort to maintain sonar contact with its target throughout the attack, rather than lose contact by passing over the submarine. Compared to the depth charge, which had to be timed and positioned with precision, the Hedgehog was a crude weapon, but it was effective enough. The Allies also developed better tactical doctrines. The convoy system itself was perfected over time, escort groups working in coordination with practiced efficiency, aircraft equipped with searchlights and radars that forced U-boats away from the main action. They broke German radio codes, a fact unknown to U-995's crew until the war was over, which meant that many of the ambushes that seemed to come from nowhere had in fact been prepared in advance, because the Allies had read the orders that sent the U-boats to particular coordinates. U-995 existed in this landscape of mutual technological escalation, each patrol she undertook reflecting the current state of a competition that had no final victor, only a victor in the war itself. The boat's physical structure carried the marks of this struggle. Antenna arrays bristled from her conning tower. Her hull had been modified and reinforced in places where combat stress had revealed vulnerabilities. The crew had been trained and retrained on new systems that appeared and disappeared with disorienting speed. 1 month the search receiver worked perfectly. The next month, the Allies had changed their radar and the signal could no longer be heard. 1 month, the schnorkel was installed. The next month, everyone understood that its acoustic signature betrayed position to any Allied vessel with even basic sonar capability. The U-boats and their crews had to adapt constantly, had to accept that no modification was permanent, no advantage lasting, and no tactic so effective that it would not be neutralized within weeks. The human cost of this technological competition was immense, but invisible in ways that charts and specifications could not capture. Installing new equipment meant crowding already unbearable spaces even further. Learning new procedures meant exhaustion and mistake-making during patrols, when mistakes could be fatal. Operating equipment that was unreliable created psychological strain. Was that sonar contact an echo, a school of fish, or an actual escort vessel? The crew of U-995 developed a technical competence born of necessity, men learning to operate and maintain systems they had never trained on in peacetime. Systems that were often improvised or modified in ways that original designers had never intended. They became experts in failure modes, in jury-rigging repairs, in coaxing a few more miles from machinery that was already running far beyond its design limits. The fundamental truth underlying this entire technological race was that the submarines were losing. Better sensors, better weapons, and superior numbers had shifted the balance decisively. The German U-boat arm had nearly strangled Britain's supply lines in 1942. By 1943, even before U-995 was commissioned, that moment had passed. The Allies had adapted, had innovated faster and better, and had deployed resources in quantities that the German Navy could not match. The improvements that U-995 received, the better radar warning, the schnorkel, the modified torpedo systems, were real and significant, but they were responses to disadvantages that could not be erased. They bought time. They extended patrols. They occasionally allowed a U-boat to evade a threat or achieve a success that would have been impossible with older equipment, but they did not reverse the underlying strategic trend. Yet for the men aboard U-995, these technologies were not abstractions or statistics. They were the specific tools with which they had to survive the next patrol, the next depth charge attack, the next night on the surface, waiting for an aircraft that never came. The radar search receiver meant the difference between warning and surprise, between a desperate dive and a doomed one. The schnorkel meant the possibility of staying submerged longer, of remaining invisible while still maintaining diesel power. The modifications to torpedo systems meant the possibility of hitting a target rather than missing it. In a war where the odds were increasingly stacked against them, the crew of U-995 accepted every innovation, understood every new system, and learned to function with whatever technology the German naval yards could manufacture and install. They were not equipped with the weapons of victory. They were equipped with the tools of survival, and in 1944, survival itself had become the measure of success. The Norwegian coast had become something between a fortress and a cage. By the time U-995 and her sister boats operated from these northern waters, the fjords and deep water anchorages that made Norway strategically indispensable to the Reich had also become the front line of a war fought not on land but from above. The geography that protected the boats between patrols, the towering granite walls that rose thousands of feet from water so deep it swallowed sound, the narrow approaches that made air attack difficult, the natural concealment that no artificial harbor could match. These same features would concentrate the boats and their crews into increasingly vulnerable positions as the Allies learned to find them. Norway had been occupied for nearly 4 years by the time U-995 joined the Arctic flotillas. What had begun in 1940 as a rapid military conquest had hardened into a permanent German occupation designed to serve two strategic purposes: to secure the northern flank against Soviet attack, and to provide operating bases for the U-boat war against the Anglo-American alliance and the Soviet Union. For the submariners, Norway became the familiar edge of their world, home between the patrols, a place of repair and resentment, supply and surveillance, where the ordinary business of keeping a submarine fleet in operation played out in occupied territory that was never entirely secured. The U-boat bases themselves represented an extraordinary feat of military engineering and industrial commitment. Trondheim, Narvik, Alta, and especially Kafjord, near North Cape, hosted flotillas of submarines whose operational range reached into the Barents Sea and across the Arctic approaches to Britain. The bases were not merely anchorages or docks. The Germans had invested in substantial permanent infrastructure, recognizing early that the concrete U-boat pens constructed during the Battle of the Atlantic could not be replicated easily in Norwegian fjords, where geography offered natural protection, but facilities had to be built from scratch in the hostile climate of the far north. The most famous of these installations was the massive pen facility at Kafjord, built between 1942 and 1944 to house the largest German submarines and provide shelter against air attack. The construction itself had consumed thousands of workers, German engineers, and forced labor from across occupied Europe. The pens at Kar were carved partially into the mountainside, with thick reinforced concrete roofs that could withstand bomb blast and the weight of the rock above them. The structure was less a building than a feat of excavation and pour, designed to the specifications that the Luftwaffe's own engineers insisted upon, tested against bomb penetration and blast effects calculated from experience on the Channel coast. The underwater approaches to the pen entrances were kept clear of ice and obstruction throughout the Arctic winter, an engineering problem that required constant maintenance and vigilance. Inside these pens, U-boats could be sheltered from aircraft, protected from observation by RAF reconnaissance sorties, and shielded from the worst of the weather that made the Barents Sea a landscape of violence in any season. But the pens were only one part of a vast and intricate logistical network that had to sustain the U-boats and their crews. Supply vessels shuttled between the bases, carrying food, fuel oil, fresh provisions, and replacement parts manufactured in factories hundreds of kilometers away in Germany. Shore facilities at each base included repair shops, administration buildings, barracks for the crews, and ammunition magazines where the torpedoes and other ordnance required for each patrol were stored with the kind of security appropriate to weapons that could change the course of a campaign. U-995 and her crew would have become familiar with the procedural rhythm of these bases: the arrival in the pen after weeks at sea, the immediate work of unloading damaged equipment and beginning repairs, the rotation of crew members to shore accommodation for rest and recovery, the consumption of fresh food that had become a luxury for submariners, and the slow but methodical process of resupply and rearming that prepared the boat for her next departure. The bases employed thousands of men and women in shore positions: mechanics and engineers, administrative staff, medical personnel, cooks and stewards, guard details, and security forces. The occupation economy of Norway had been reshaped partly to support this submarine war. Norwegian factories and workers had been conscripted into German service. Norwegian resources, including fish, minerals, and manufactured goods, had been diverted to support the occupation. The relationship between the German occupiers and the Norwegian population had hardened by 1944 into something between resentment and cold coexistence. The Norwegians understood what the U-boats were doing, understood that these submarines left their fjords to hunt and kill merchant sailors and Allied soldiers. They understood, too, that they themselves lived under military occupation, and that the prosperity of the occupying power came at their expense. The German submariners, for their part, inhabited a parallel world. They were professional sailors serving their nation. They were bound by duty and oath. Most of them were young enough that they had grown up in the Nazi state and had never known any other political system. The moral complexity of their situation, that they were fighting in a war of conquest, serving a criminal state, operating from occupied territory where their presence was resented, was a reality that most of them did not permit themselves to examine too closely. The suspended reality of port time created a strange psychological space for submarine crews. A patrol in the Arctic was an ordeal that lasted weeks. The boat would return to base with supplies exhausted, the crew physically depleted, the machinery worn by the grinding stress of extended operations in extreme cold and heavy weather. In port, there was the opportunity for genuine rest, for officers to sleep in proper beds instead of in the tight bunk spaces allocated aboard the boat, for the crew to eat hot food that was not recycled from limited stores, for maintenance work to proceed without the constant threat of discovery and attack. The men could receive medical attention for the injuries and illnesses that accumulated from living in an unheated steel tube in Arctic waters. They could receive mail from home, a tenuous connection to a world that was increasingly foreign and surreal as the war reached its middle years and then its final collapse. But the psychological weight of patrol time was something that Rest Ashore could not entirely dispel. The submariners knew the statistics. By 1944, they knew better than anyone what the odds of returning from patrol truly were. The casualty rates in the U-boat arm had reached levels that made the service a slow form of attrition. For every captain and every crew member, the return to port carried the unspoken knowledge that the next patrol might be the last one, that the bunk in the barracks might soon be allocated to someone else, that the meal being consumed might be one of a finite and shrinking number of remaining meals. The Kriegsmarine kept detailed records of U-boat losses and crew fates. The information was not widely distributed, but it was known to the command structure, and rumors and knowledge filtered down through the fleet. Men who survived multiple patrols had seen their friends and fellow officers not return. They had read the casualty lists posted on the base notice boards. They understood, with the clarity that comes from proximity to death, that U-boat service had become a form of slow suicide, a volunteer contribution to a war that was already lost, even if official propaganda insisted on continued resistance and final victory. The physical installations at the Norwegian bases became themselves targets of an escalating Allied bombing campaign that would reach its climax in the final months of the war. By 1944, the RAF and USAF had given high priority to the destruction of German U-boat bases and infrastructure. The strategic bombing offensive was, in part, an expression of frustration. The losses inflicted on the U-boat fleet had already been catastrophic through other means, through depth charge attacks by escort vessels, through being rammed by determined convoy escorts, through mechanical failure in the harsh Arctic environment. But the Allies understood that the U-boat bases in Norway represented a concentration of valuable assets. If the bases could be destroyed or severely damaged, the U-boats would be denied shelter and would have to disperse or return to German ports, effectively reducing their operational range and increasing their vulnerability. The bombing campaign against the Norwegian bases involved some of the largest air raids of the war. The RAF's specialized squadrons, equipped with heavy bombs, including the massive reinforced steel-nosed bombs designed to penetrate concrete, mounted raids that reached the fjords with increasingly accuracy and devastating effect. The largest pens, the most heavily defended installations, the supply dumps and repair facilities, all became objectives for bombing attacks that saturated the air above the fjords with explosions and fire. U-995 would have been in these pens during at least some of these raids. The crew would have felt the massive pens shake and tremble with the impact of bombs nearby, would have heard the sound of explosions echoing through the structure, would have been acutely aware that the concrete walls that were meant to protect them could themselves become a trap if they were seriously damaged, or if the entrance was blocked by debris. The psychological impact of experiencing a bombing raid while in a submarine in a concrete pen was something between the security of shelter and the horror of entrapment. The raid damage was extensive. The concrete could be repaired, but the disruption to operations was profound. U-boats had to be moved or redeployed. Supply lines were interrupted. The bases themselves became less secure, less reliable as sanctuaries between patrols. The personnel stationed at the Norwegian bases lived with the knowledge of this increasing danger. The Luftwaffe units tasked with air defense of the bases were themselves thin and overwhelmed by the scale of the Allied bombing effort. By 1944, German air superiority over Norway was a memory. The Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee protection against RAF and USAF bombing raids. The anti-aircraft gun emplacements surrounding the bases could engage attacking aircraft, and some bombers were shot down, but the weight of air attack could not be stopped. German officers and men at the bases understood this. They understood that the fortress of concrete and steel was being slowly demolished by bombs dropped from altitudes at which German fighters could barely reach. They understood that Norway was becoming not a secure base, but an increasingly exposed position, that the Arctic sea lanes that the U-boats patrolled were themselves coming under heavier attack, that the supply situation was becoming desperate as merchant shipping losses accumulated and German industrial capacity contracted under the weight of air bombardment of the German heartland. The bases remained operational until nearly the end of the war, but the margin of safety had eroded to nearly nothing. U-boats still operated from Norway into 1945. Patrols were still launched, but the sense that the institutions were fragile, that the facilities could be destroyed or captured at any moment, that the entire enterprise was unraveling, permeated everything by the last winter of the war. The occupation of Norway also carried a peculiar political and psychological dimension that affected the submarine crews who were stationed there. The German occupation of Norway had been justified in terms of military necessity, preventing an Allied invasion, securing resources, protecting the German northern flank. The Norwegian government had been displaced and replaced with a German military administration that later gave way to a puppet regime that attempted to govern on German behalf. But the Norwegian people had never accepted the occupation. Resistance movements had begun forming immediately and had persisted throughout the war, carrying out sabotage, gathering intelligence, and keeping alive the symbolic assertion that Norway was not truly part of the German Reich. The German occupation forces, including the submariners, inhabited a landscape that was superficially calm but fundamentally hostile. The landscape itself, the mountains, the fjords, the vast forests of the interior, was Norwegian. The population was Norwegian. The history was Norwegian. The Germans were visitors, administrators, exploiters, and conquerors. The relationship was never one of integration or acceptance. The German servicemen, including the submarine crews, enjoyed certain advantages and privileges that came from being representatives of the occupying power. They could command resources, could requisition supplies, could enforce their will through military authority, but they also lived with the awareness that they were not welcome and would not be remembered with gratitude when the occupation ended. The submarine crews in particular were engaged in a war that the Norwegian population viscerally understood. The U-boats leaving the fjords were leaving to attack shipping, to kill merchant sailors, to carry on a campaign of destruction that had devastated Norwegian merchant shipping and Norwegian commerce. Even though many of the U-boats' actual targets were British or American or Soviet rather than Norwegian, the psychological association was clear. The submarines and their crews were instruments of German power, and German power was strangling Norway. The final months of the war brought everything to a crisis in the Norwegian bases. As the German military situation on the continent deteriorated in 1945, the threat to the Norwegian bases increased. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east into the Arctic regions. The Allies were preparing for a possible invasion of Norway, or at minimum were planning to liberate it as the war in Europe came to an end. The German command structures were becoming increasingly disorganized as communications with Berlin broke down, as the central authority of the Nazi regime collapsed, and as individual commanders were left to make decisions based on fragmentary information and their own assessment of what should be done. The U-boats operating from Norway in the final weeks of the war faced an extraordinary situation. Some boats were ordered to conduct suicide attacks, to deliberately attack Allied forces, with the knowledge that return was unlikely. Some boats were ordered to attempt to break through to the Atlantic and continue the U-boat war from other bases. Some boats, following the planned Operation Regenbogen, were scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. U-995 herself survived this chaos in a form that would become historically significant. She was brought to the surface, she was surrendered to Norwegian forces, and she was handed over intact to the Norwegian Navy. This survival was not inevitable. The U-boat fleet lost many boats to scuttling in Norwegian waters in 1945. The pens that had sheltered them were eventually abandoned or captured. The German occupation of Norway ended in the final days of the war with a speed that surprised almost everyone. The bases that had seemed so permanent, so thoroughly German, so integrated into the occupying administration, were evacuated or surrendered within days. U-995 and a handful of other boats survived the collapse. They would become artifacts of a history that Norway wanted both to remember and to forget. Reminders of years of occupation, witnesses to a war waged from their shores, and eventually, in the case of U-995, a permanent memorial to everything that that war had meant. The Norwegian bases had been places of extraordinary human effort and suffering. The workers who built the pens had often been forced laborers, subject to conditions that wore them down and that killed many of them. The German soldiers and sailors who served there had been involved in an occupation that was inherently unjust, even if most of them did not permit themselves to think of it in those terms. The Norwegian population had endured the occupation and had waited for liberation with resilience and determination. The U-boats themselves, the boats like U-995, had operated from these bases, had been maintained and supplied and sent out on patrols, had carried out a campaign of war that was the paradox. By the beginning of 1944, the men aboard U-995 were living inside a paradox. Their boat was modern, well-maintained, and still lethal in the cold waters of the Arctic. Yet everything around them was contracting. The great German offensives on the Eastern Front were grinding backward. The Normandy invasion would come in June, opening a Western front that Germany could not close. and across the vast industrial landscape of the Reich. The American and British bombing campaign was accelerating beyond anything German planners had imagined possible. For the U-boat service, which had once believed itself on the threshold of strangling Britain into submission, 1944 arrived like a sentence already handed down, waiting only to be carried out. The strategic situation had shifted in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had dominated U-boat operations through the early war years, was effectively over. The Allies had won it. Convoy losses had fallen to unsustainable levels for the Germans, while U-boat losses had climbed past anything the shipyards could replace. New boats were being laid down. Yes, the Type 21, the Type VIIC revolutionary submarines with underwater speed that might have changed everything if they had arrived in time. But they were still months away from operational readiness, and time was the one resource Germany no longer possessed. The U-boat arm that had once hunted freely across the Atlantic now found itself pushed to the margins of German naval strategy. Still dangerous, but no longer central. Still demanded, but no longer expected to turn the tide of war. U-95 and boats like her were increasingly redeployed to secondary theaters, where the Allies had not yet achieved complete air and naval superiority. The Arctic remained one of these theaters. The Murmansk convoys still ran, still delivered tanks and trucks and fuel to Stalin's armies, still represented a way to directly damage both Britain and the Soviet Union through a single effort. Norwegian fjord bases remained operational, though barely. The German occupation of Norway, now 4 years old, had settled into the grip of an increasingly militarized administration. The submarine bases at Trondheim, Narvik, Hammerfest, and North Cape became fortified islands in a sea of growing uncertainty. The concrete U-boat pens, originally built as protection against Allied air attack, now began to feel less like shelters and more like bunkers for a doomed garrison. The men who served there knew, at some level they all understood, that the war was no longer to be won. The question that animated 1944 was how long it could be continued, and at what cost. The crews arriving to man boats like U-995 in 1944 were not the same submariners who had sailed in 1942 or 43. Experienced captains and warrant officers were increasingly scarce. Many had not survived their patrols. Others had been rotated ashore to help train the next generation, or they had been lost in accidents, in routine mechanical failures that killed men just as effectively as enemy depth charges. The replacement personnel who arrived in the Arctic bases were younger, more recently trained, less seasoned in the slow accumulation of knowledge that kept a U-boat and her crew alive. This degradation was never explicitly discussed in official communications, but it was felt everywhere. The old submariners could smell it. A boat commanded by a captain with 10 patrols behind him operated differently than one led by a promising officer with 2. There was no substitute for combat experience, and yet Germany was running out of commanders who possessed it. Morale in the Arctic flotillas through 1944 occupied a strange emotional register. It was not the aggressive confidence of 1941, when U-boats seemed capable of anything. It was not the desperate defiance that would emerge in the last months of the war. Instead, it existed in a kind of suspended middle state, persistent, dutiful, tinged with a fatalism that was rarely spoken aloud, but present in every conversation. The men aboard U-995 knew their statistics. They knew how many of their brother boats had been lost. They knew the names of commanding officers who had sailed with them in the Baltic training grounds and who had not returned from their first patrol. They knew that the average life expectancy of a U-boat in active service was measurable in months, not years. And yet they still went to sea. They still conducted their patrols. still hunted for convoys, still endured the crashes of depth charges and the hours of silence when Allied vessels were hunting them beneath the surface. The propaganda apparatus of the regime continued to function, channeled through base commanders and political officers attached to the flotillas. There were still official proclamations about wonder weapons on the horizon, about the strategic genius of German leadership, about the fundamental unsoundness of the Allied coalition. These messages reached the men aboard U-995 through radio broadcasts, through printed materials, through the words of officers who were themselves uncertain what to believe. The modern historical consensus suggests that such propaganda had become largely hollow by 1944, that men in the armed forces saw through the official narratives and believed them less with each passing month. And there was truth to this skepticism. Yet propaganda was also just one element in a more complex picture. The men aboard U-995 were held in place not merely by ideology or manufactured enthusiasm, but by the very human bonds that had formed among them, through shared danger, shared hardship, and the knowledge that the man beside you in the darkness might be the difference between living through the next depth charge attack or not. The camaraderie of submarine crews was one of the most distinctive features of the U-boat service, and it functioned as a kind of alternative motivational force when official propaganda began to ring hollow. A U-boat was a place where hierarchy was present, but also compressed, where the spaces between men were measured in inches, rather than the hierarchical distances that separated an officer from a common soldier in most military units. The captain gave orders from the control room, yes, but he was also living in the same recycled air, eating the same thin rations, exposed to the same terror, when the ASDIC signals suddenly became rapid and urgent. Officers and enlisted men ate together, slept in shifts using the same bunks, worked together during the complex procedures that kept the boat alive. This proximity created a different kind of social space than existed elsewhere in the Wehrmacht. It was not egalitarian, but it was intimate, and that intimacy became a powerful force, holding crews together as the war deteriorated. The operational tempo in the Arctic through 1944 remained steady, even as resources declined. U-995 continued her patrols out into the Barents Sea, hunting for the convoys that still made their way to Murmansk. The tactics had hardened and become more defensive over time. Approaching a convoy meant running a gauntlet of escort vessels, and worse, the possibility of carrier-based aircraft that could appear suddenly from above and force a crash dive into depths where the boat might be rattled by depth charges for hours. The captains of boats like U-995 had learned hard lessons about the cost of aggressive attacks. They had learned to be patient, to stalk convoys across multiple days, to look for weak points rather than attempt frontal assaults that would draw concentrated fire from an alert escort force. These were not the glorious tactics of the early war. They were the tactics of men trying to inflict damage while minimizing the risk of being destroyed in the attempt. The Norwegian bases themselves became increasingly strained as 1944 progressed. The German occupation of Norway had never been truly secure, even as the Wehrmacht held military dominance. The Norwegian resistance was active, though often limited, in what it could accomplish without drawing overwhelming German retaliation. The local population was under occupation, but not conquered in spirit, and this created an underlying tension that manifested in small ways. Damaged supplies, unreliable information, the simple withdrawal of any kind of civilian cooperation that went beyond the legally required minimum. For the U-boat men, Norway was not home. It was a place to work and to rest between patrols, but it was occupied territory, and the men knew it. Many German sailors had also been in Norway long enough to understand the depth of Norwegian hostility. even if little was said about it openly. The bases were secure from a military perspective, ringed with anti-aircraft guns and patrol boats. But they existed in a world of growing uncertainty. The threat from Allied air power was the invisible enemy that shaped everything in 1944. While U-995 and other submarines were at sea, the Reich itself was being systematically torn apart by American daylight bombing and British night bombing. The cities that the men came from, the industrial centers they had learned about in school, the places where their families waited, all of these were increasingly under attack. The news that filtered through to the Arctic bases was fragmented and often delayed, but it was enough to create a gnawing awareness that the home front was collapsing. The U-boat yards in Hamburg at Blomund Foss, where U-995 herself had been built, were no longer safe places to build ships. The concrete bunkers that housed submarine construction were surrounded by rubble from repeated bombing raids. German naval construction capacity, which had been impressive before the war, was being progressively destroyed. For men aboard U-995, this meant that if their boat was badly damaged, there might not be the resources to fully repair her. It meant that replacements for crew members killed in action might not arrive. It meant that the institution that had sent them to sea was itself fragmenting under the weight of industrial bombardment. Yet even as the strategic walls closed in, even as the men aboard U-995 became increasingly aware that the war could not be won, the boat continued her patrols. She hunted. She attacked when the opportunity arose. Her crew maintained their diving drills, kept their weapons ready, performed the endless cycle of maintenance and watchkeeping that a submarine required. There was an element of habit to this, certainly, but there was something else as well. There was the simple human need to perform your role competently, to do what you had been trained to do and trusted to do, to meet the expectations of the men around you. The German Army and Navy did not collapse into mutiny or open defiance in 1944, despite the mounting evidence that the war was lost. There were no widespread refusals of orders, no mass surrenders. Instead, there was a grim continuance, an acceptance of duty performed under conditions that made no strategic sense, but that demanded continuance anyway. The men aboard U-95 were caught in this current, and they moved with it because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. By the end of 1944, as winter descended on the Arctic and the days shrank toward total darkness, the reality was undeniable, even if it could not be openly spoken. Germany was dying. The Eastern Front had contracted drastically. The Normandy beachhead had been established and consolidated, and was now spawning breakouts that would soon pour thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of troops into the heart of occupied France. The American and British air forces had achieved a level of superiority that was almost beyond the comprehension of anyone who had known the conflicts of earlier years. The U-boat arm, which had once seemed capable of winning the war through sheer determination and tactical brilliance, now existed in a kind of institutional haze. Boats went to sea, and some came back, and some did not. Officers and men were replaced. The cold of the Arctic drove the temperature inside the pressure hull down and drew men inward into themselves. And still, U-995 continued her patrols, because that was what boats did, because orders came from shore, and those orders had to be obeyed, because the war had achieved an inertia that could not be easily stopped, even as everyone involved began to understand that its end was no longer in question. What sustained the men of U-995 through 1944 was not hope, which had largely evaporated by then, but rather a kind of stubborn human refusal to accept that all their effort had been meaningless. There was dignity in doing your duty well, even when that duty served a collapsing cause. There was meaning in the trust that the men aboard the boat placed in each other. a bond that would outlast the war, and that some of these men would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The walls were closing in on all sides. The strategic situation was deteriorating toward collapse. And yet U-995 remained afloat, remained operational, remained a functioning instrument of war in the service of a state that was itself becoming increasingly unreal. The boat and her crew endured the year, not because they believed in victory, but because the alternative to continuance was surrender or sinking. And neither of those moments had yet arrived. They would come, within months, with the spring of 1945. By the autumn of 1944, the strategic world that had sustained the U-boat war was collapsing. The Soviet army was advancing from the east with inexorable momentum. The American and British forces that had broken out of Normandy were rolling toward the Rhine. The German army, which had once seemed capable of conquering Europe, was now fighting for survival on two fronts simultaneously. Yet, in the Norwegian fjords where U-995 and her sister boats sheltered between patrols, the machinery of the U-boat war continued to turn. Orders still came from Berlin. Patrols still departed into the Arctic darkness. Torpedoes were still loaded. Diesel tanks were still filled. And young men were still sent to sea knowing, with a clarity that no propaganda could obscure, that the cause they served was already lost. The war had not yet ended in formal surrender. But for those who understood military mathematics, the war was over. What remained was only the manner of its ending. U-995 received orders for what would become her final operational patrols in a situation of stark and absolute contradiction. The boat was physically intact, materially capable, and her crew, though thinned by transfers of experienced men to newer construction and worn by months of Arctic operations, remained disciplined and trained. The Kriegsmarine still maintained a formal command structure. The Navy still expected obedience to orders transmitted through radio, encrypted by Enigma machines, that German naval officers believed were secure, unaware that the cipher had been broken years before. But the context in which those orders arrived had transformed entirely. Germany's economy was shattered by years of strategic bombing. The industrial base that had produced submarines in the hundreds was now producing them in the dozens, and those under construction would never be completed. The U-boat arm itself had lost more than 3,000 men killed in action, captured, or missing over the course of the war, a casualty rate that had climbed to catastrophic levels in the final 2 years. Officers and men who had survived into late 1944 had long since passed through any illusion about victory. They knew that their superiors also knew, and yet the orders came, and they obeyed. The daily experience of U-95's crew during these final patrols reflected a surreal dissonance between routine and apocalypse. Morning was the same as it had been 4 years earlier, when the U-boat arm was at its height. Men woke in cramped berthing spaces, consumed thin coffee and hard bread, and went to their stations. The boat was prepared for sea through a sequence of checks and procedures that had not changed. The diesel engines received their ritual inspection. The torpedoes in their tubes were examined for corrosion and movement. The hydroplanes were tested. The ventilation systems were run. All of these acts were performed by men who had learned long ago to compartmentalize despair, to focus on the immediate and controllable, while refusing to contemplate the vast, uncontrollable thing that was happening beyond the hull. This kind of psychological survival was essential. A man cannot function aboard a submarine if he allows himself to contemplate his own probable death with full clarity at every moment. The human mind protects itself through ritual, through the absorption in technical detail, through the formation of bonds with the men beside him that transcend rational calculation. And so the preparations continued, as if the war would last indefinitely, even as radio broadcasts grew more frantic, and the news that leaked through official channels grew steadily worse. The patrols themselves had changed character in ways that reflected the collapse of the broader German strategic position. When U-995 first entered Arctic waters, the convoys running to Murmansk were still valuable strategic targets, and the patrols that hunted them had a clear operational purpose within the larger context of the war. By late 1944, the situation had inverted. Soviet production no longer depended on British and American supplies in the way it had in earlier years. The Murmansk convoys still ran, but their loss would no longer alter the fundamental equation of the Eastern Front. The U-boats hunting them were no longer weapons of war in any meaningful sense. They were gestures toward war, performances of warfare maintained for their own sake. U-995's commanding officers, during these final months, were not deluded men. They understood the situation, but they also understood, with perfect clarity, that to cease patrols without formal orders would constitute mutiny, and mutiny was not an option available to officers of the German Navy. And so the boats went out, and the men aboard them went to their stations, and they performed the mechanics of hunting and attacking with the same precision they would have employed had victory still been possible. The Arctic itself had become, if anything, more hostile. Winter in the far north during 1944 brought storms of extraordinary fury and seas that could crush a surfaced submarine into wreckage in seconds. The U-boats operated in near-total darkness for months on end, a darkness broken only by the ghostly luminescence of snow and ice and the strange glow of the northern sky. The cold was so extreme that mechanical systems began to fail without warning. The diesel engines became sluggish in the frozen air. The rubber and leather components of the submarine's systems froze and cracked. Frostbite and chilblains were endemic among men who had to spend hours standing watch on the open conning tower, scanning the horizon for the shapes of convoy vessels through sleet and driving spray. The crew of U-995 during these patrols was also smaller than it had been in earlier years. Experienced men, petty officers with years of service, engineering specialists, the kind of sailors around whom the operational competence of the boat revolved, had been transferred to other duties, or in many cases, had been killed. Their replacements were younger, less thoroughly trained, and themselves affected by the general collapse of morale that had begun to spread through the German armed forces by the winter of 1944. Yet the boat still functioned, the procedures still held. The standard of seamanship and technical competence aboard U-95 remained high, maintained by the institutional inertia and the personal discipline of the officers who commanded her. The radio orders that U-995 received during these final patrols carried an increasingly abstract quality. In the earlier years of the war, orders had been linked to specific intelligence about convoy movements, to tactical objectives within a coherent strategic framework. By 1944, the signals from BDU headquarters often simply directed boats to proceed to a general operating area and conduct patrols, with no specific targets in view and no clear expectation of meaningful results. These orders were transmitted in Enigma cipher, a fact that gave them an air of security that was entirely illusory. What U-995's crew did not know, could not have known, without access to intelligence sources available only to the highest levels of German command, was that British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been reading these transmissions for years. The strategic intelligence derived from breaking the German naval cipher had allowed the Allies to route convoys away from U-boats and to direct anti-submarine forces toward the submarines themselves, with accuracy that seemed, to German commanders, almost supernatural. U-995's final patrols took place in this environment of hidden disadvantage. The crew believed their communications were secure. They believed that their route to the operating area and their patrol procedures were being conducted in secrecy. In fact, the broader position of every U-boat at sea was known to senior Allied commanders within hours of any significant course change. This disparity between German perception of the situation and the actual situation was one of the profound realities shaping every patrol conducted in the war's final months. The material conditions of U-995's patrols had also deteriorated noticeably by late 1944. Fuel supplies were uncertain. Replacement torpedoes were increasingly difficult to obtain. Food stocks aboard the boat, never abundant, became genuinely sparse as the supply system serving the Norwegian bases began to break down under the stress of the military situation on the continent. Men who had already lost weight through the chronic deprivation of submarine service began to lose more. The medical supplies aboard the boat, never comprehensive, became depleted and were not being fully replaced. Minor injuries or illnesses that would have been treated and resolved in an earlier period of the war now simply had to be endured. Tuberculosis and other respiratory infections spread through the crew quarters as the air circulation system, which had never been adequate, became less so. The boat's machinery, though kept in service condition through the devoted labor of the engineering crew, showed increasing signs of strain. Emergency repairs that should have been conducted in the relative comfort and resources of a proper shipyard were instead being improvised aboard the boat using makeshift materials. The engineering spaces became dark and difficult to work in as the electrical system became increasingly unreliable. And yet the patrols continued, driven forward by habit and by orders, and by the absence of any alternative that did not require men to openly resist military discipline in a totalitarian state. The question of what would happen to U-95 and the rest of the surviving U-boat fleet when the war finally ended was beginning to occupy the minds of men aboard the boat, though such discussions had to be conducted with caution. In the earlier years of the war, German submarine crews had believed they were winning, or at least fighting for a cause that would succeed. By 1944, no one aboard U-995 could maintain such a belief. Some men clung to hopes that the regime might somehow achieve a negotiated peace, that the technical advantages of new U-boat designs, the improved schnorkels, the newer torpedoes, might yet alter the balance. These hopes were thin and grew thinner with each passing week. Others simply accepted that Germany would be defeated, and their primary concern became one of personal survival, ensuring that when the war ended, they would be on the winning side rather than dead or captured. The command officers aboard U-995 were aware of the existence of what was being called Operation Regenbogen, the contingency plan that would require all surviving U-boats to be scuttled, sunk by their own crews, rather than captured by enemy forces. The idea was anathema to many, not on ideological grounds, but simply because it represented the final pointlessness of everything that had been done, the crews sent to sea, the boats built and deployed, all to be deliberately destroyed, rather than allowed to be taken intact. But this was what they were being ordered to be prepared to do, and orders were orders. The convoy actions that U-995 conducted during her final patrols had become, in many cases, exercises in failure. When the boat made contact with a convoy, which itself was now less frequent because Allied routing and escort procedures had become so effective, the approach and attack rarely resulted in successful torpedo strikes. Allied anti-submarine techniques had evolved to such a degree that a U-boat attempting to maintain contact with a heavily escorted convoy under full daylight was extremely likely to be driven down by aircraft before a favorable attack position could be developed. The depth charge attacks that followed, and they always followed, because the Allies now had the aircraft and escorts in overwhelming numbers to prosecute a detected U-boat until it either escaped or was destroyed, were as terrifying as they had ever been. The explosions that shook the hull and rattled the crew in their compartments. The pressure changes that caused the sea to seem to press inward from all sides with physical weight. Yet men aboard U-995 had learned to endure these attacks almost with equanimity. Some became fatigued by the constant danger, a weariness that approached numbness. Others maintained a kind of defiant stoicism, a refusal to acknowledge that the danger was as absolute as it truly was. And a few experienced submariners maintained a kind of dark humor about the proceedings, the grim comedy of being hunted by an enemy that was now so superior in numbers and technology that the outcome of any deep-water engagement was essentially predetermined. The command decisions made by U-995's captains during these final patrols reflected the impossible situation in which they found themselves. These officers understood their duties to Germany, but they also understood their duties to the men under their command. The two were increasingly in conflict. To continue aggressive patrols against heavily defended convoys was to continue sending men into danger with increasingly poor prospects of success or even survival. To refuse patrols or to conduct them in such a manner as to minimize the risk to the boat was to violate military discipline and the orders transmitted from Berlin. The captains resolved this tension through small compromises and the maintenance of professional standards. Patrols were conducted, but when the tactical situation appeared especially unfavorable, when enemy forces were particularly dense, when the boat's material condition was questionable, when the weather made a safe approach impossible, the commanding officer could decide to withdraw from the area, a decision that was formally permissible under the standing orders, but that also acknowledged the reality that some days simply could not result in a successful attack. These calculations were made moment by moment, hours on end. The captain in the conning tower, the eyes pressed to the periscope, looking at the shapes of enemy ships and weighing the possibility of sending his men into action against the probability that the attempt would simply result in their deaths. The last radio signals that U-995 transmitted during her final patrols before the war's end carried a quality of futility that would have been impossible to miss to anyone reading them who understood the broader military situation. They reported negative contact with convoys, or contacts that had been broken off without attack, or attacks that had resulted in no confirmed hits. The tonnage of shipping sunk by individual U-boats had declined precipitously. In the earlier years of the war, successful U-boats had been able to sink tens of thousands of tons of merchant shipping in a single patrol. By late 1944, significant tonnage was becoming genuinely difficult to achieve. These reports were being transmitted by radio operators aboard U-995 using the same encryption systems they had always used. Reports that they believed were secret, but which were being read in Berlin and simultaneously in London, in the headquarters of the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. Information flowing into intelligence systems that were far more sophisticated and far better coordinated than the Germans understood. The reports were also, implicitly, the words of men who were documenting their own impotence, their own journey toward a conclusion, whose exact timing remained uncertain, but whose general character, defeat, collapse, the end of everything they had been told to believe in, was becoming increasingly impossible to deny. By early 1945, as U-995 prepared for what would ultimately be her final patrol, the situation had become openly desperate, even to those who still attempted to maintain official optimism. Germany's territorial losses had accelerated dramatically. The Soviet army had crossed the Vistula and was approaching East Prussia and Silesia. The American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into Germany proper. The city of Hamburg, where U-995 had been built just 2 years earlier, had been reduced to rubble by bombing. The U-boat pens at Hamburg and other German yards were useless. The yards themselves had been so thoroughly destroyed that new construction had entirely ceased. By the spring of 1945, the machinery of the Third Reich was grinding to a halt. The Red Army was closing in from the east, already fighting in the suburbs of Berlin. The Americans and British were streaming across the Rhine, and the Wehrmacht's back was broken across 1,000 battlefields. In the Arctic and in the fjords of Norway, where U-995 and her sister boats lay in their reinforced concrete shelters, the war had become a kind of strange theater without an audience. The men who crewed these submarines knew, with the clarity that comes only when all illusions have been stripped away, that their war was over. But how it would end, whether they would go down fighting, whether they would scuttle their boats in honor according to the codes they had been taught, or whether they would simply surrender to whatever Allied forces found them first, remained, in those final weeks, a question without a clear answer. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commanding officer of the entire U-boat arm, and the man who had directed submarine operations since his appointment more than a decade earlier, issued his last operational orders in early May as the Russian armies encircled Berlin and the American forces moved towards the German heartland. Dönitz himself would be named Hitler's successor in the dictator's final testament, a transfer of power so surreal that it seemed almost comic, the head of state of a nation that no longer existed, governing a country that was already divided among victorious enemies. But in those closing days, Dönitz still held command of the submarines, and he faced an agonizing choice. Under a contingency plan, known as Operation Regenbogen, Operation Rainbow, German submarines were under standing orders to scuttle themselves, rather than allow their boats to fall into Allied hands. The thinking had been developed years earlier, based on German naval tradition, and on a cold calculation about the strategic value of protecting submarine technology from enemy acquisition. A captured U-boat could be studied, its designs dissected, its technology transferred. But a sunken U-boat was merely a loss, and losses were what Germany had already suffered in abundance. Yet, as May 1945 unfolded with the speed of catastrophe, a different logic began to emerge. Dönitz received news that some U-boats had already surrendered to British and American forces, crews that had made the calculation that survival, real survival rather than a gesture of defiant sinking, was now what mattered most. Facing the practical reality that he could no longer effectively command the scattered remnants of his fleet, Dönitz issued a succession of orders that reflected this bitter recognition. On the 7th of May, with German forces surrendering unconditionally in the west, he sent orders to all U-boats at sea to cease fire and to make for the nearest Allied port, flying black flags, if they had them, to signal their peaceful intent. The order was a surrender, though it was phrased in the language of naval courtesy. The U-boats were to surface, to abandon their weapons, to surrender themselves and their crews to the enemy. For men who had been trained, indoctrinated, and conditioned over years to believe that surrender was the final shame, the order came as a shock, even though it was, in its way, a merciful one. It meant that U-95's final patrol would not end in a torpedo attack or a ramming, or the crushing silence of a sinking. It would end in surrender. U-995's commanding officer in those final days was Kapitänleutnant Alexander Wimmel, a man who had seen enough of war to understand what surrender meant and what it cost. The order to cease fire and to make for the nearest Allied port reached the boat through the radio channels that still, miraculously, functioned. Channels that had grown progressively quieter over the preceding weeks as more and more U-boats failed to return from their patrols or were sunk in harbor during the final bombing campaigns. Wimmel faced a choice that was theoretically simple but psychologically complex. He could follow the order, which came from the highest authority still remaining to him, and steer his boat towards surrender, or he could attempt to enact